Section 68 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 68. The Massacre of the Huguenots. Charles IX was one of those who opposed the Huguenot massacre, obstinately refusing at first to sign the decree his mother presented. But his was a weak and credulous nature, so at the end of a very few days, wearied by Catherine's importunities, and convinced besides by her false statements that the Huguenots were really plotting against his life, he suddenly seized the pen and signed the order for the massacre, exclaiming hysterically, "By God's death, since you will kill the admiral, kill them all! Kill all the Huguenots in France, so that none may be left to reproach me! By God's death, kill them all!" Having thus wrung from her weak and bewildered son the permission she desired, Catherine entrusted to Guise and certain other influential Catholics the charge of murdering the Huguenot wedding guests who were still tarrying in Paris. It was settled that the massacre should take place on St. Bartholomew's Day, and that the bells of the famous old church near the Louvre should ring out the signal for the attack at 2 o'clock in the morning. The houses where the principal Huguenot noblemen lodged were all marked in advance, and the conspirators agreed to recognize each other, even in the darkness, by means of a white sleeve or badge which all were to wear on the left arm. At first, the plan had been to sacrifice only a few of the leaders, but the lists gradually grew longer and longer, so that by the time the signal bell pealed forth, a general massacre had been arranged. Most of the prominent Huguenots in Paris, and many of their followers, were slain, for they were taken by surprise in the night, and thus unable to offer any defense. Besides, the gates of the city were closed and guarded so that none could escape. The Duke of Guise, without troubling himself about lesser victims, proceeded immediately to the house of Admiral Coligny. After posting men to prevent any attempt at escape, he sent guards upstairs to murder his aged political rival. Breaking into Coligny's sleeping room, these assassins found him there, calm and composed, although at the first alarm he had bidden his servants escape by way of the roofs, saying, "For a long time past I have kept myself in readiness for death. As for you, save yourselves if you can." When the door was broken open, the guard abruptly inquired, "Are you Coligny?" "Yes, I am he, young man, and you ought to respect my gray hairs," replied the admiral, adding philosophically, "but you will not shorten my life much." The murderer, having thus ascertained that this was really the victim he sought, dealt Coligny a mortal blow, and had barely done so when he heard his master call out impatiently from below, "Is it done? Show me some proof!" Although the breath had not yet left the admiral's body, the assassin hurled him out of the window at the duke's feet, where someone wiped the blood away from the dead man's face, to enable the duke to make quite sure that the right person had been dispatched. Standing there, gazing at his victim, the Duke of Guise touched the corpse with his foot, crying in a tone of wonder, "Gracious, I didn't know he was so tall!" Then, turning to his followers, he boldly exclaimed, "Courage, companions, we have begun well, on to the others!" It is said that Charles IX., hearing the bells peal out their terrible signal, was seized with sudden repentance, and sent a messenger off in great haste to stay the duke's hand. But the order did not arrive till after Coligny was murdered, so Guise coolly sent back word, "Tell the king it is too late." Meantime, other murderers were at work also. Not only were more than 2,000 Huguenots slain, but a few Catholics as well, for the great disorder made a good opportunity for wreaking private revenge. Even in the Louvre the massacre went on, the Huguenots there being led down into the palace yard, and only Henry of Navarre and young Cond6 were allowed the alternative of Mass or the Bastille. In the new Queen of Navarre's bedroom a few Huguenots were murdered, some frantic followers of the bridegroom having tried to take refuge there from the foes so hotly pursuing them. When the day dawned, Charles IX. himself is said to have gone out on a balcony of the Louvre, where, armed with a crossbow, he shot at the fugitives who were vainly trying to gain the bridge and flee across the river. We are also told that Catherine and her maids paraded the streets, gazing complacently at their victims. Besides Henry of Navarre and the Prince of Cond6, the king spared his Huguenot nurse and his physician Paré, because he was much attached to them both and depended upon them for comfort in many ways. End of section 68. Section 69 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 69. Death of Charles IX. The massacre at St. Bartholomew, August 24, 1572, was, as we have seen, aimed mainly against the aristocratic Huguenots, the leaders of their political party, for it was intended to carry out Alva's advice, which was, "Take the big fish and let the small fry go. One salmon is worth more than 1,000 frogs." The massacre was not confined to Paris, however, as orders for similar murders were sent to various provinces. In some places these commands were obeyed without question. In others, the governors bluntly refused to conform, and even 2 executioners declared that, while they were ready to do their duty and put to death persons who had been tried and found guilty, they utterly refused to execute those against whom nothing had been proved. The governor of Bayonne wrote, "Sire, I have communicated the commands of your Majesty to the inhabitants of the town and the soldiers of the garrison, and I have found good citizens and brave soldiers, but not one executioner. On which account they and I humbly beseech you to employ our arms and our lives in things we can effect. However perilous they may be, we shall willingly shed therein the last drop of our blood." Another noble soul declared, "Sire, I have received an order under your Majesty's seal to put the Protestants of this province to death. I respect your Majesty too much not to believe that this letter is a forgery, and if, which God forbid, the order be genuine, I respect your Majesty too much to obey you." Notwithstanding such refusals, the massacre in other provinces proved so extensive that more than 20,000 Huguenots were slain in France. The news of the massacre of St. Bartholomew was received very differently by various people. Chancellor de l'Hôpital, for instance, who had always opposed persecution, was horrified when he heard about it, and cried, "Perish the memory of this execrable deed!" But at the Spanish court, king and courtiers openly rejoiced, as over a great victory. It was inevitable that the massacre of St. Bartholomew should rekindle civil war. During the ensuing Fourth Religious Conflict, the Protestants entrenched themselves in La Rochelle, which was vainly besieged by the Catholic forces (1573). But after great hardships had been endured by both besieger and besieged, a peace was concluded near that city, giving the Huguenots liberty to worship in certain towns in the south, for most of the Huguenots lived in southern France. This had barely come to pass when the Duke of Anjou, a brother of the king, was elected to occupy the throne of Poland (1574), thanks to the bribes which his mother scattered lavishly among the electors to secure this honor. But he had barely left home to be crowned in Poland when his brother Charles IX fell dangerously ill, and it soon became only too evident that this king, too, would die without leaving any children. The death of Charles IX was pitiful in the extreme, for he suffered greatly. Being a consumptive, he had numerous hemorrhages, and the sight of his own blood always recalled the massacre which he had countenanced. At such moments, it was with difficulty that his old Huguenot nurse could calm his terrors. This poor young king died at 24, frantically imploring God's pardon, his keen remorse proving that he was neither as hardened nor as guilty as his mother Catherine, who died some years later without ever having expressed regret for that cruel massacre. Although Catherine often gave Charles IX bad advice, she nevertheless discovered what was likely to please a fickle people, for she once said, "Twice a week give public assemblies, for the specific secret of French government is to keep the people always cheerful. They are so restless you must occupy them during peace, either with business or with amusements, or else they will involve you in trouble." End of section 69. Section 70 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 70. An Effeminate King. As Catherine de' Medici was regent all through King Charles IX's minority and even after he had come of age, he can never be said to have really reigned. It is therefore not surprising that the Queen Mother continued to hold the reins of government in the name of her third son, Henry III, to whom a messenger had been dispatched in hot haste. Henry of Anjou, King of Poland and now King of France also, had greatly distinguished himself in his early youth by winning the battle of Jarnac, but he had not kept the promise which he then gave for bravery and energy. He was now a weak and worthless youth, devoted solely to pleasure, and thinking of nothing but the gratification of low tastes. He was so fond of dress that many of those who saw him declared he looked either like an effeminate king or a masculine queen, and he devoted far more time to his garb and personal adornment than to any affairs of state. Fearing lest the Poles might try to prevent him from leaving their country, or at least might detain him a long time in making suitable arrangements for their government during his absence, he escaped from this kingdom like a criminal, riding fast until he passed the frontier, and excusing himself to the one official who tried to stop him, by stating he was most anxious to see once more a lady whom he loved. This lover-like anxiety, however, did not prevent him from lingering several months at Vienna and Venice, to enjoy the festivities offered to him there, so it was 3 months after Charles IX's death before Henry again set foot in France. Henry III's first declaration was that all his subjects must live as Roman Catholics or quit the realm. He made this announcement with great firmness, but he was of such a weak and vacillating nature that very soon after he changed his policy, and began instead to favor the Protestants. The fact was, he found the whole country in a dreadful state, and did not know which party to favor. There were now not only Catholic and Protestant factions, but also one of moderates, led by the Duke of Alençon, the king's last brother, whose ambition was to establish liberty of conscience everywhere, and who tried to secure Queen Elizabeth's aid by becoming a suitor for her hand. Instead of making serious attempts to bring order out of this chaotic condition, the new king devoted all his time and money first to a grand coronation festival, and then to his wedding with a cousin of the Guises. The new queen was unfortunately not strong-minded enough to influence him for good, and her days were spent like his, in devising new costumes, in painting her face, and in giving elaborate entertainments to the king's favorites. These young men, who were popularly known as his darlings, mignons, copied all the fashions set by the king and queen, and affected the utmost extravagance and languor, in connection with a fierce courage, which spurred them on to challenge anyone on the most trifling excuse, until dueling became the reigning passion at court. The king and queen were extravagantly fond of pets, so one and all of these darlings pretended great fondness for them also. One of them actually received a title as reward for inventing a large flat basket which could be suspended around the king's neck by a broad blue ribbon, and which would contain, at one time, several of the toy dogs from which this monarch could not bear to be parted. We are also told that the huge neck ruffs, which had been in fashion during the previous reigns, were discarded by Henry III, mainly because he was afraid lest his younger brother, whose privilege it was to fasten this adornment, should use a poisoned pin, thus getting rid of him so as to assume his place on the throne. But this king's love of dress had one good result, for it made him introduce uniforms among his troops, so that soldiers thereafter went into battle all arrayed alike, and the army thus assumed a more seemly appearance. Both Henry of Navarre and Cond6 were forced to renounce their faith after the massacre of St. Bartholomew, but Cond6 effected his escape after a while, rejoined the Huguenots, and sought help in Germany, where he managed to raise a large army. On invading France, the German Protestant forces were bravely met by the Duke of Guise, who, in that encounter, received the wound in his cheek to which he owes his historic nickname of the Scarred, Le Balafré. But Condi's army made its way to join the Huguenots in southern France, and Henry of Navarre fled from court and escaped thither also. Soon after, a new peace was signed, giving the Huguenots greater rights than before. It was mainly because the king seemed so indifferent and the Protestants were so aggressive that the Catholics, under the leadership of the Duke of Guise, formed what is known as the Holy League. Its open object was to uphold the Church, but it also secretly aimed to place Henry of Guise on the throne instead of the king, whose inefficiency had by this time thoroughly alienated the people's affections. It is true that Guise was not next of kin, but he boldly based his claim to the throne on a supposed descent from Charlemagne, and fancied he could gain his purpose by getting the good will of the Catholics, who, after all, composed 9/10 of the population. These ambitious designs of the Guise family upon the crown were at first kept secret, but Henry III. Saw what influence the duke was gaining by siding so openly with the Catholic party, and determined to figure as leader of the League himself. He therefore boldly declared himself its head, although the Duke of Guise continued to direct all the movements of this powerful party. End of section 70. Section 71 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 71. The Battle of Coutras. The Sixth Religious War, which now broke out, was carried on with great cruelty, and ended by granting the Huguenots some of the judgeships and 8 fortresses as a sort of guarantee that their rights would thereafter be respected, 1577. Notwithstanding this agreement, which proved so advantageous to the Protestants, the Catholic party continued to predominate in France, and especially in Paris, where the 16 wards of the city were under 16 magistrates, all of whom were strong partisans both of the League and hence of the Duke of Guise. In a vain attempt to regain the allegiance of many of the nobles whom his weak and effeminate conduct had alienated, Henry founded the Order of the Holy Spirit, Saint-Esprit, in 1578, appointing at first only 24 members, which made it a very select affair. This was the second order of knighthood which had been founded in France, the first being that of Saint Michel, instituted in 1469, which counted by this time so many members that it was no longer considered a distinction to belong to it. There had been already, as we have seen, 6 religious civil wars in France. A 7th was about to break out, but this time new complications arose to embitter both parties, for the Duke of Alençon had died. As long as this prince had lived, the Catholics fully expected him to succeed his brother, Henry III., whose weak constitution was being rapidly undermined by his fast life. But when Alençon passed away without offspring, it became apparent that the crown, at the death of the present ruler, would fall to Henry of Navarre, next of kin, but a Huguenot. The idea of a heretic upon the throne of France was unendurable to the bulk of the population, which was, and has always been, staunchly Roman Catholic. For that reason, the Holy League's plan to place the Duke of Guise on the throne now gained many adherents. Still, there were many Frenchmen who did not deem it right to attempt to change the natural order of succession. Besides, Henry of Navarre had many of the manly qualities which appeal strongly to the nation. for while he too loved pleasure, he was nevertheless a thorough soldier, brave, shrewd, and cordial, making friends easily, holding them fast after they were once made, and ever ready to bear anything and everything for the good of his party or people. It was in 1587 that Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots, found himself face to face with the royal army at Coutras, led by the king's favorite Joyeuse. The royal forces outnumbered their opponents, and when the Huguenots, according to their custom, knelt before entering into battle, one of the courtiers cried to Joyeuse, "Look, look, the Huguenot traitors are already beaten. They prostrate themselves. They tremble." But a bystander, knowing better what such conduct portended, replied, "Do not be deceived, my lord. I know these said Huguenots. They are pleased now to appear down in the mouth and sanctimonious, but when we come to the charge, we shall find them devils and lions of courage." At this statement, it is said, some of the royalists were badly frightened, and turning to Joyeuse, timorously inquired, "What is to be done?" Their leader, who was quite as brave as dandified, retorted briefly, "Die!" and he set them the example by perishing on the battlefield after having fought to the last. Just before the battle began, Henry of Navarre said to his relatives, "Cousins, I only remind you that you are of Bourbon blood, but with God's help I will show you today that I am your elder." To this Condé retorted, "And we will show you that you have worthy juniors." Thus saying, all plunged into the fray with such ardor that in less than an hour the royalist general was dead, his troops in full flight, and Henry of Navarre had won a triumph which gave him great prestige in France. Although dauntless in battle, Henry of Navarre was a generous foe. Before beginning the fight, he sent word to the royalists what terms of peace he was willing to grant, and when, on the point of surrendering, the foe inquired what conditions he would now demand, he promptly answered, "The same as before." The Huguenot victory in the south of France was offset in the north by the success of the Duke of Guise, who drove back an invading army of German Protestants. The war, therefore, continued fiercely, and as it was carried on by Henry the King, Henry of Guise, and Henry of Navarre, it is often known as the War of the Three Henrys. Had the Catholics been united, there is no doubt that they could have triumphed quickly over the Huguenots, but they were greatly divided. The Duke of Guise was aiming to secure the throne for himself, his ally Philip II of Spain claimed it for his daughter, a niece of Henry III, and the French king, who wanted to retain his power as long as possible, was desperately jealous of these rival claims for his crown. In his anger over Guise's growing popularity, Henry III forbade the duke to return to Paris, but in spite of this, Guise shortly after marched boldly into the city. When the king ordered his guards to eject the disobedient nobleman, the Parisians rose up and formed barricades in the streets to defend the man who had become their idol. 1588. Indeed, it was only because the duke forbade it that the people refrained from attacking the king's guards. End of section 71. Section 72 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 72. The Murder of the Guises. While the Duke of Guise and the Queen Mother were holding a meeting on the day of the barricades to see if they could not make peace, King Henry III escaped from his palace and left the city to go in quest of an army wherewith to drive away the insolent subject who had refused to obey his orders. When the duke discovered that Catherine had tricked him merely to enable her son to effect his escape, he became bitterly angry, and promptly made himself master of Paris. But when the Duke of Guise bade the mayor of the city to take certain measures to maintain order, the mayor boldly refused to obey any commands save those issued by his king, declaring openly, "It is a great pity when the servant drives away the master, but my soul is God's and my heart is the king's, although my body is with the wicked." All 16 magistrates, however, were in favor of the duke and carried out his orders. Paris soon assumed the aspect of a besieged city, and it looked as if the breach between the king and his subject might prove final. Then Henry III., who was always changing his mind, suddenly declared he would pardon his rebellious subject, promised to exterminate the Huguenots, and named Guise general of the army. Next, hoping to satisfy an angry people, Henry III. bade the States General assemble at Blois, but all the members belonged to the League and insisted on giving the Duke of Guise still more power. His sister wore a pair of golden scissors dangling from her belt, declaring they were intended to shear off the locks of Henry III. When he should be locked up in a monastery, as had been done to some of the do-nothing kings. This made the king hate the Guises more than ever. Now, the haughty Duke of Guise was so brave that he once said, "Even if I were to see death enter by the window, I would not go out by the door to escape her." He therefore paid no heed whatever to secret warnings that his life was in danger. In fact, his sole comment was a contemptuous shrug of his handsome shoulders, and the scornful remark, "He wouldn't dare." But this haughty nobleman was to find out his mistake before long. One morning, very early, the king summoned the Duke of Guise and the duke's brother, the cardinal, to his council room in the castle of Blois. He had previously arranged that 40 of his guards should be posted in his bedroom so as to attack and slay an inconvenient subject. Then he had his chaplain say mass, and was impious enough to have the following prayer openly read: "That God may give the king grace to be able to carry out an enterprise which he hopes will come to an issue within an hour, and on which the safety of France depends." After a brief term of waiting in the king's antechamber, the Duke of Guise was summoned to the royal bedroom, where, instead of being received by the monarch as he expected, he was pounced upon by the murderers. He bravely tried to defend himself, but was felled by repeated blows. His brother, the Cardinal of Guise, hearing a struggle in the adjoining apartment, vainly tried to rush to his rescue, but guards had previously been detailed to seize him also, and he was locked up in a cell where he was put to death the next day. The king, who had been waiting anxiously in an adjoining room, learning that Guise was dead, marched into his bedchamber, where he stood a long time looking down at the body. Finally, he touched it with his foot, just as Guise had touched Coligny 16 years before, exclaiming as he did so, "Gracious, how tall he is! He looks taller dead than alive." Should you ever visit the castle of Blois, you will see a dark stain on the floor, which is said to have been made by the blood of Guise when he was thus basely murdered by a French king's orders. But Henry III. Evidently considered that he had done a most praiseworthy deed in ridding himself of the Duke of Guise and of his clever brother, for he proudly announced to his court, "At last I have killed the reptile, and to kill the reptile is to destroy the venom." Then, going to visit his mother, Catherine, who lay on her deathbed, he triumphantly declared, "Madam, I am once more King of France. I have killed the King of Paris." Catherine faintly replied, "What, you have killed the duke? God grant, my son, you have not made yourself king of nothing. It is one thing to cut your cloth, and another to make it up." Evidently shrewd Queen Catherine plainly saw that her son was not the man to retrieve his past mistakes. The few days which still remained to her were spent, it is said, in bitter regret that she would not be able to resume the reins of government and carry out her many ambitious schemes. Meantime, the Leaguers, justly indignant at the murder of their idol, the Duke of Guise, declared Henry III. No longer worthy to reign. Mayenne, a brother of the dead Guise, was made leader of their party and took possession of Paris, where he ruled as king just as his brother had done. Even children marched through the streets loudly singing the praises of the Guise family and cursing the king, who had been formally excommunicated from the church because of the murder of the cardinal. As the gates of the capital were thus closed to him, Henry III. soon changed his policy again, making friends this time with Henry of Navarre, his next of kin and heir. The two Henrys, uniting forces, proceeded immediately to St. Cloud, near Paris, whence they intended to make a determined assault upon the rebellious capital. But the very day before this assault was to take place, a fanatical monk cleverly made his way into the royal camp, declaring that he had dispatches and a secret message to deliver to the king. The guard therefore let him into Henry III.'s presence and withdrew to a little distance. Then the monk, who believed that he would earn heavenly bliss if he slew the enemy of his church and of his country, suddenly drew a dagger out of his sleeve and stabbed the king in the abdomen. Jerking out the weapon, Henry III. Struck his assassin and gasped, "This wicked monk has killed me," before he fell to the ground. The king was right. His wound was mortal, but he lived long enough to make various arrangements, and he solemnly warned his cousin, Henry of Navarre, "Be very sure of one thing. You will never become King of France unless you first become a Catholic." Then, still jealous of the Guises, and fearing lest that family might after all secure the power which he could no longer hold, Henry III. Made the noblemen around his deathbed swear allegiance to Henry of Navarre, who, as soon as the last of the Valois died, became Henry IV. of France, the first of the famous Bourbon branch (1589). The Valois race had ruled over the country for 260 years, and had given 13 kings to France. All through that period there had been a succession of wars. First, the Hundred Years' War with England, then several wars in Italy and for the balance of power, and finally the destructive religious or civil wars which had not yet reached their end. Thus the Valois, by their inefficiency and love of pleasure, did great harm to France. But they also did much good, in that they encouraged letters and fine arts, thus leaving many beautiful buildings and countless art treasures which are now the proud boast of the country. End of section 72.
Section 73 of the Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 73. Winning a Crown. Henry IV., who was called to the throne by the murder of his cousin, Henry III., was born at Pau, in southern France, where the people still show the huge tortoise shell which served as his cradle. His mother, the Queen of Navarre, a woman of unusual strength of body and mind, sang cheerily at his birth, so that her child should be light-hearted, and she allowed him to be brought up exactly like the peasant children of the neighborhood, in order that he might become hardy, active, and independent. Henry lost his father when only 9, and at 15, as we have seen, was taken to the camp of the Huguenots to become nominal leader of their forces. But he showed himself so brave and skillful that before long he was the acknowledged head of his party. He used to say, "Nature made me hot-tempered, but anger is a bad counselor, and since I have known myself, I have always been on guard against so dangerous a passion." But although he showed self-control in restraining his anger, he never deemed it important to govern any of his other passions, and was, for instance, in the habit of falling violently in love with almost every pretty face he saw. We have already seen how Henry of Navarre went to Paris to marry the king's sister, and how his life was spared in the massacre of St. Bartholomew. Later on, you remember, he effected his escape from court, and returned to the Huguenot party, where he immediately abjured the Catholic religion, which he had professed only in order to escape death. Although Henry III. Had taken the precaution, before dying, to make the nobles swear formal allegiance to his cousin and successor, Henry IV., he had no sooner passed away than many of the Leaguers left the camp with their troops, declaring that nothing would ever induce them to fight for a Huguenot king. But some Catholics remained loyal to him, and one man expressed their sentiments when he cried, "You are the king of the brave, sire, and none but cowards will abandon you." Being left with only 4,000 men, the new monarch found it impossible to carry out the plan of assaulting Paris, so he withdrew his troops. Meanwhile, the extreme Leaguers, under the guidance of Mayenne, proclaimed the captive Cardinal of Bourbon, Henry's uncle, King of France. But as this cardinal died in captivity, and never enjoyed the royalty thus thrust upon him, he does not count at all in the annals of the country. Very many Catholics urged Henry to be converted to their faith, and promised to support his claim to the crown if he would do so. Even the Pope is said to have remarked at that time, "Were the King of Navarre here, I would go down on my knees to implore him to end and heal these divisions by becoming a Catholic." There was some hope that Henry might do so, because he was by no means a zealous Huguenot, and because he frequently said, "If I am wrong, instruct me." Still, he was too blunt and straightforward to be willing to change even a nominal religion for expediency's sake only, and so the war continued. Henry IV., who aptly described himself at this time as a king without a kingdom, a husband without a wife, and a warrior without money, marched off to Dieppe, where the people gave him a warm welcome. But Henry always showed a great dislike for formality and long speeches, and put an end to all such fuss on this occasion by exclaiming, "No ceremony, my children! I want only your love, good wine, good bread, and friendly faces." Shortly after this, Henry's forces were attacked by those of the Leaguers under Mayenne at Arques, 1589. There Henry won a brilliant victory, so was able to write jovially on the morrow to a friend who had been absent that day, "Hang yourself, my brave fellow! We have fought at Arques, and you were not there." The following year Henry gained much territory, and fought another pitched battle with Mayenne and his Leaguers at Ivry, 1590. Many anecdotes are related in regard to this battle. The king, whose forces were so small that he had to depend greatly on his German allies, had been too poor to pay for their services. He was, therefore, seriously annoyed when their leader, Baron of Schomberg, on the eve of the fight, came and asked for money for his men. Irritated by this demand, which he could not satisfy at that moment, Henry haughtily exclaimed, "Men of honor do not ask for money on the eve of battle." But the next morning, realizing how unjust he had been, he marched up to the Baron in the presence of his army, and frankly apologized, saying, "Baron, I insulted you yesterday. This may be the last day of my life, and I would not willingly take away with me the honor of a gentleman. Pardon me, and embrace me." The Baron then answered, "Sire, yesterday, it is true, your Majesty wounded me, but today you kill me, for the honor you do me will oblige me to lay down my life in your service." Having thus atoned for his bitter words, Henry gave the following instructions to his troops: "My friends, keep your ranks in good order. If you lose your ensigns, pennons, or guides, the white plume that you see on my helmet will lead you on the way to honor and glory." It is to this speech that we owe frequent historical and literary allusions to the white plume of Navarre. Mayenne's army was composed of choice French and Spanish troops, but all Henry's arrangements were nevertheless made either to win or die. When one of his officers came to inquire what provisions had been made in case of retreat, he sternly rejoined, "There will be no retreat, save the battlefield." Then, too, when his men seemed to be on the point of giving up, and were already beginning to flee, Henry IV. Saved the day by thundering at them, "Turn around, you cowards, and if you won't fight, at least see me die!" But just as soon as the battle was won, all Henry's generous inclinations came to the front once more, and he bade his followers, "Strike hard the foreigner, but spare every Frenchman," thus showing that he could not forget that every native was one of his subjects. This Battle of Ivry was a most brilliant victory. Knowing that it was the turning point of Henry's career, one of his followers joyfully exclaimed, "You have, sire, committed the bravest folly that ever was, in staking the fate of the kingdom on one cast of the dice." Having won this battle, Henry's next move was to press on and besiege Paris, 1590, which he held for 4 months under strict blockade. At first there were sufficient provisions, so the inhabitants did not suffer too grievously, but during the last 2 months the famine became so dire that many people died of hunger. The kind-hearted king could not bear to think of the suffering in the city. Some historians declare that he allowed convoys of provisions to pass his lines, so as to relieve the people's distress, but the fact is that Henry IV. was far too good a general to permit anything of the sort. Of course, the people's suffering could be ended at any time by surrendering. Meanwhile, the only supplies which entered the city were those intended for the sick and wounded, against whom no brave man ever makes war. But the Spanish sent excellent troops, which succeeded in relieving the threatened capital, just as Henry was about to become master of it. Seeing he could not now take it without a more bloody contest than he was able or willing to wage, he quietly withdrew, exclaiming, "I am like the true mother in the judgment of Solomon, for I would rather not have Paris at all than to see it all torn to pieces and dead." End of section 73. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi ceded land. Section 74 of the Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 74. Conversion of Henry IV. Having failed to take Paris, Henry ranged around here and there, and finally laid siege to Rouen, 1591 to 1592, being assisted in this work by his English and German Protestant allies. But once again, the Spanish came to the rescue just in time. Although Henry had won 2 brilliant victories, and had proved his courage and patriotism, most of the French Catholics still opposed him. Neither side could conquer the other, even with the help of foreigners. Perceiving at last the truth of Henry III's prediction that only a Catholic could win the crown of France, Henry IV consented at last to change his religion. We are told that his conversion occurred after the following odd conversation. "Do you," said the king to a great Protestant divine, "believe a man can be saved by the Catholic religion?" "Undoubtedly," replied the clergyman, "if his life and heart be holy." "Then," said the king, "prudence dictates that I embrace the Catholic religion, and not yours, for in that case, according to both Catholics and Protestants, I may be saved, but if I embrace your religion, I shall not be saved according to the Catholics." After receiving some purely nominal instruction, Henry made all his arrangements to abjure the Protestant religion and become a Roman Catholic. He is said to have written playfully to one of his friends, "Paris is well worth a mass. On Sunday I shall take the perilous leap." When all was ready, the king knocked at the door of the Abbey of Saint Denis, which the bishop opened, inquiring, "Who are you?" "The king," answered Henry. "What do you seek?" "To be received into the fold of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church." Then kneeling, Henry impressively went on, "I protest and swear, in the presence of God Almighty, to live and die in the Catholic faith, and to protect and defend it against all, at the peril of my life and blood." After this public declaration of faith, the bishop granted him absolution and led him into the church, where mass was celebrated and a Te Deum was sung in honor of a royal concession to the wishes of about 9/10 of the people. While Henry's change of religion was urged by his wisest counselors, some of his friends, Protestants by conviction, flatly refused to follow his example. His greatest adviser, Sully, for instance, wrote him, "Should I ever change my religion, it would be from an internal conviction only. Neither avarice, vanity, nor ambition would ever lead me to do so. Were I to do otherwise, I should give your Majesty good reason for suspecting the sincerity of a heart I could not guard faithfully for God." Henry's next move was to be solemnly crowned in the cathedral at Chartres. Most of the Catholics were now willing to obey him, but it was 8 months after his conversion before the gates of Paris opened to him at last, and he could enter his capital without striking a blow. Many of the Parisians were so happy to see their king that they crowded about him, shouting, and when his guards would fain have driven them away, Henry good-naturedly exclaimed, "No, let them alone. Let them all press around me. They hunger to see a king once more." Meantime, the Spanish troops, as you know, had entered Paris under pretense of helping Mayenne and the Leaguers, but in reality so as to obtain the crown for their own little princess, a granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici. They were now obliged to leave, and as Henry watched them file out, he called out to them gaily, "Goodbye, gentlemen! My compliments to your master, but don't ever come here again." Within the next 2 years, Henry became master of all France, for he was shrewd enough to buy many of the places which he did not conquer. When Sully, his friend and prime minister, was instructed to bribe the governor of Rouen, and grumbled at the price, the bluff king replied, "My friend, you are a fool. Give the man his price. We will afterwards pay everything with the very booty which they surrender to us." The Holy League, which had been all powerful for many years, had lost much of its influence in France when the Spaniards joined it to gain the crown for their princess. Such power as it still boasted was undermined forever by a satire, Satire Ménippée, which made such unmerciful fun of the Leaguers that their association was almost killed by sheer ridicule. Finding nearly all Catholics ready to obey their recently converted king, Mayenne finally made his submission too, and was received by Henry IV. In a garden, where the king made this stout nobleman tramp around at such a lively pace that the poor man almost expired from fatigue. Henry, who was still spare and active, laughed heartily when he saw the pitiful plight of his former foe, and jocosely remarked in an aside to Sully, "One more turn, and I shall have punished this fat fellow for all the trouble he has given us." Then, pausing and turning to Mayenne, the merry king added aloud, "Confess, cousin, that I have been going a little too fast for you." "Faith, faith, sire, it is true. If your majesty had gone on, I think you would have killed me," gasped Mayenne. "Shake hands, cousin," Henry now went on, "for, by God's truth, this is all the ill you need ever fear from me." It was this generous spirit, this readiness to forget all past injuries, which soon turned most of his former foes into truly loyal subjects. Having gained possession of his kingdom, Henry called an assembly of notables, whom he addressed in the following remarkable way: "I have not called you together to impose my own will, as my predecessors were wont to do, but to receive your counsels and to follow them, a notion which does not often come into the head of a king, and a gray bearded conqueror like me. But the vehement love I bear to my subjects makes everything easy to me." It was this love also which made him anxious to ascertain the purchasing power of even the smallest coin, to learn the scale of wages for all kinds of work, and the mode of living of his peasant subjects, for he fully realized that it was only after such data had been obtained that he would be able to tax the nation justly. To maintain his place as King of France, Henry was obliged to wage a 3 years' war against Spain (1595 to 1598), which still asserted claims to the crown. Early in the course of this war, Henry won a marked victory (Fontaine Française), where, we are told, he bravely exposed his own life to save that of his friend Biron. Later, when a strong Spanish army seized the city of Amiens, he set out to besiege it, joyfully exclaiming, "My friends, I have long enough played the King of France. Now it is high time for me to play the King of Navarre." He said this because it was while still styled King of Navarre that he had won his greatest laurels as general. He now added to them by quickly retaking Amiens and forcing an end to the war on terms favorable to himself and France. In the same year, 1598, the king promulgated the Edict of Nantes, which gave Protestants the right to practice their religion wherever they pleased, allowed them the same civil privileges as the Catholics, and thus put an end to the civil and religious warfare which had desolated France for 36 years. This Edict of Nantes gave France the peace she so sorely needed. End of chapter 74. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi, ceded land. Section 75 of the Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 75. Henry IV's Second Marriage. Having finished warfare at last, and become sole master of his kingdom, Henry IV immediately proceeded to reorganize it so that it might become prosperous once more. Although this king had no moral grandeur of character, he was so shrewd and far-sighted a man, and had so able a prime minister in Sully, that the finances at the end of his reign were in prosperous condition, and there were even 42 million francs in reserve in the royal treasury. Henry himself took a lively interest not only in agriculture, but also in commerce and manufacture. He encouraged the culture of silkworms, the making of glass and pottery, and the weaving of silks and velvets. The first weavers were even allowed to ply their trade in the galleries of the Louvre, where are now exhibited some of the finest paintings, statues, etc., that the world can show, and he founded the Gobelin tapestry establishment. He had many good roads built, for he realized that good means of communication would greatly enrich the country. Besides, he has the honor of planning the canals of France, and of constructing the one which unites the Seine and the Loire. Henry IV. Embellished Paris in many ways. We are told that when a Spanish ambassador once commented upon the difference between the city under his rule and while it was in the hands of the Leaguers, he quietly remarked, "Oh, you see, then the father of the family was not at home. Now that he is here to care for his children, all goes well again with them." The French were pleased with this paternal attitude, which was further shown by one of his sayings often quoted, namely, that his main ambition was to see France so prosperous that every peasant could afford to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. Henry is also known as a great colonizer. It was during his reign that Quebec was founded by the French in Canada. It is a matter of history that Henry never lived on good terms with the wife who was forced to marry him just before the massacre of St. Bartholomew. They separated soon after their wedding, and Henry more than once courted some other lady, whom he promised to marry as soon as he could secure an annulment of this marriage. On the strength of such a promise, one fair lady, Gabrielle d'Estrées, long expected to become Queen of France, and therefore assumed great airs. On one occasion she ventured to find serious fault with the Prime Minister, Sully, even demanding that he be discharged, whereupon the king, ever loyal to his faithful friend, turned indignantly upon her, saying, "Know, madam, that one friend like Sully must be dearer to me even than such a sweetheart as you." This lady died before the king could obtain a divorce, and Henry, who had always shown great affection for her, wore black in token of mourning, although until then kings had never donned anything but violet under such circumstances. It was very important that Henry should have an heir to succeed him on the throne of France, and as his wife Margaret was willing that he should be divorced from her, Henry continued to press his suit for an annulment of his first marriage, until the Pope granted it, because lack of free consent on the part of the bride had made the marriage invalid from the beginning. Very soon after the divorce was obtained, Henry married Marie de' Medici, a niece of the famous Catherine. The new queen brought an immense dowry, and came into France with a brilliant suite, thus introducing into Henry's court more luxury, gaiety, and elegance than had been seen there for many a day. The following year, Henry concluded the Treaty of Lyons with Savoy (1601), whose duke had sided with the Leaguers, and had given him an immense amount of trouble during the religious wars. By this treaty, Henry won some territories in the west, where the people spoke French. This delighted him, for he often said that he had no objection to the Emperor keeping all German lands, and the Spanish king all Spanish lands, but he wished all French soil to belong to the kingdom of France. Henry proved a very wise and powerful ruler. Looking beyond his own borders, he suggested that each of the nations of Europe should send a certain number of delegates to a supreme council, which was to regulate all matters of warfare by arbitration. But before this utopian scheme could be carried out, it was necessary to humble the powerful House of Austria, to which belonged both the ruler of Austria and the monarch of Spain, so near the end of Henry's reign, he planned a war for that purpose. End of chapter 75. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi Ceded Land. Section 76 of the Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 76. Death of Henry IV. The policies followed by Henry IV. were were not approved by some of his subjects, especially the friends who had fought by his side throughout the religious wars, and who felt angry because he did not show them greater favor, or bestow upon them all the advantages they thought they deserved. Their jealousy and greed gave rise to several conspiracies, among others, one in which the king's friend Biron was implicated. When this plot was discovered, Biron was given every chance to confess and be forgiven, but seeing he was obdurate, the king finally had him arrested. Thinking it impossible that Henry, who had saved his life in battle at the risk of his own, should ever proceed seriously against him, this nobleman showed no anxiety throughout his trial, but the king had determined that impartial justice should be meted out on this occasion, and when Biron was found guilty and sentenced to death, made no attempt whatever to save him from the scaffold. Henry IV. Had no children from his first marriage, but he had 6 from his second, and 3 of these children lived to wear crowns, although one daughter, the unfortunate wife of Charles I. of England, lost hers in time. Henry was a most indulgent father. We are told that when the Spanish ambassador presented himself at the Louvre one day, he found the king on all fours, serving as a steed for his young children. Glancing up at his stately visitor, Henry smilingly inquired, "Mr. Ambassador, are you a father?" Upon receiving an affirmative reply, he genially continued, "Very well, then I will just finish this game." So Henry IV. Went on entertaining the little ones for a while longer, before rising to give a formal audience to an august ambassador. One day, when a historian submitted a work which he was writing, Henry ruefully inquired, "But why do you reveal my weaknesses?" The author replied, "Because they will offer as good lessons to the Dauphin as the account of your many noble deeds." This answer so appealed to Henry's common sense that he promptly said, "Yes, the whole truth must be told, for were my defects to be ignored, other things would not be believed. Well, write them all down, so that I may avoid such mistakes in future." Henry had many friends of great ability, and used to consort as much as possible with the intellectual people of his time. One of the great saints of that epoch, Francis of Sales, spoke of him as "that prince so great in every respect, from whose life greatness seems, as it were, inseparable." And Henry fully recognized the saint's good qualities, for he once said, "He unites all virtues without one fault." He is the man the most fitted to root out heresy and to establish the Catholic religion solidly. When Henry was about to leave the country to carry out his ambitious plans against Austria, he appointed his wife regent, and had her solemnly crowned, knowing that otherwise her authority might not be respected. He must, besides, have felt some premonition that he was not going to live much longer, for he remarked to his courtiers, who criticized something he had done, "I shall die one of these days, and when you have lost me, you will know what I was worth, and the difference there is between me and other men." Seeing how depressed he was one day, his physician advised him to go out and take the air, so Henry suddenly decided to drive out and visit his prime minister, Sully, then detained at home by illness. While passing through a narrow street, the king's carriage was stopped by a block ahead, and during the brief pause, a half-crazed man, Ravaillac, deftly sprang up on the carriage wheel, leaned over, and stabbed the poor king again and again. Henry sank back unconscious, and died shortly after, 1610. Henry IV. Was buried in the Abbey of Saint Denis, where, even during the Revolution, his tomb was respected by an enraged people, although all the others were desecrated. An equestrian statue of the king was erected on one of the bridges in Paris, a bronze horse being brought from Italy for that purpose. It met shipwreck on the way, but was later fished up out of the sea. This statue, which was very famous indeed, remained only until the Revolution, when it was torn down and melted to supply cannon for the new republic. But a copy of it now stands at the same spot. The reign of Henry IV. Marks the end of all feudal pastimes, for after his accession no more tournaments were held in France. It also marks the time when the French language assumed the form it bears at present, given to it by the great writers of this epoch, Malherbe and Régnier, whose style is still considered classic in France. Henry IV. Was not only a great monarch, but a most popular one. His untimely death was sorely mourned by his people, fathers exclaiming to their children, "What will become of you? You have lost your father." End of chapter 76. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi, ceded land.
Section 77 of the Story of Old Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old Friends by H.A. Guerber. Section 77. The Minority of Louis XIII. Henry IV had detected in his young son and heir many signs of intense selfishness, which made him once remark to his wife, "Madam, pray God that I may live, for believe me that naughty boy there will ill-treat you sorely when I shall no longer be here." No sooner had the tidings of the king's murder reached the palace than a great sound of lamentation arose. One of the councillors rushed wildly into the queen's apartment, with such a countenance of woe that Marie de Medici, springing up from her seat, exclaimed, "Sir, the king! This tumult! Is the king dead?" Whereupon the councillor replied, "Madam, be calm, I entreat you. Pardon me, the king never dies in France. Behold the king," pointing to the 9-year-old Louis XIII, who was henceforth to be ruler of the country. We are told that it is this episode that gave rise to the saying, "The King of France never dies." The queen immediately seized the reins of government. Even before the news of the king's assassination had spread throughout the capital, all necessary measures had been taken to secure her authority, and orders issued for the Parliament of Paris to assemble on the morrow. There, in a solemn session, known as a bed of justice, because the dais of the throne resembled that of a four-poster, the little king publicly appeared to signify to the assembled councillors that it was his express wish that they should hereafter all obey his mother the regent. One of the first acts of the new government was the trial and condemnation of Henry's base murderer, who had been seized immediately after his crime and subjected to cruel torture, to force him to reveal the names of his accomplices, should he have any. But in spite of all the horrors he had to undergo, the criminal betrayed no one. He was then put to death by fearful tortures, and his body was literally torn to pieces. Although Henry's policy had been to lessen the power of the House of Austria, he had no sooner passed away than his queen began to court its alliance, thus entirely foiling her husband's designs. Then, too, being of a very weak nature, Marie de Medici proved the easy victim of any favourite who happened to catch her ear. The nobles who crowded around the queen flattered her until she allowed them such extensive privileges that they became nearly independent. They declared, "Kings have had their turn, now we shall have ours." In their greed for honours and power, they not only tried to monopolize the fair regent's attention, but also strove to wring from her the funds which Henry had saved for his coming wars. The only person at court who refused to bow down before the vain regent was Sully, Henry's councillor, who not only retained his old-fashioned mode of dress, but obstinately refused to adopt the servile manner of the other courtiers. For that reason, instead of being treated with the respect which the undeniable services he had rendered his country had earned for him, Sully was mocked by the dandified courtiers, who did not hesitate to make fun of him, even in the presence of the young king and of the queen mother. On one occasion, when thus turned into ridicule, Sully boldly addressed his young master, saying, "Sire, I am too old to change my habits. When the late king, your father of glorious memory, did me the honor to summon me to an audience on affairs of state, he was in the habit first of dismissing the buffoons and mountebanks. But in spite of this sharp protest, buffoons and mountebanks were to have their day, so Sully retired from court, foreseeing that his wise measures would soon be overthrown. Soon after Sully withdrew, it became evident that the real rulers of the country were the foster sister of the queen, Leonora, and her husband, Concini. The latter, although he had never been a soldier, managed to obtain from the queen the position of marshal, which entitled him to command the military forces in France. As the queen, like most small-minded persons, gave undue importance to form and ceremony, she surrounded her young son with much pomp. Yet, like most weak mothers, she proved either very indulgent or extremely severe. It is said that the little king once cried, "Oh, madam, pray make me fewer courtesies, but have me whipped less severely." Whenever such a punishment had to be inflicted, the queen, realizing her son's resentful disposition, always ordered that the whipping should be done by a servant closely masked, so that the king should not be able to recognize him and wreak vengeance upon him later on. As you can readily imagine, it did not take Queen Marie long to distribute to the rapacious nobles all the money which her husband had collected for the proposed campaign against Austria. As long as the money lasted, the courtiers proved most obsequious, but when her treasury was empty and there was nothing left to give them, they became angry and revolted. There was, besides, at that time, such dissatisfaction in the Rome that the queen called a meeting of the States General, 1614, in hopes that they would be able to put the affairs of state in good order once more. On this occasion, the 15th and last time that the States General met until 1789, Richelieu was one of the spokesmen, and made such an eloquent address that even then people began to perceive that he was a man of unusual ability. The States General deliberated a great deal, but accomplished very little, which may be one reason why kings did not prove anxious to convoke them again for the next century and a half. It was in the same year that the king, although only 13, was pronounced of age. But at a bed of justice he turned to his mother, begging her to continue ruling in his name, and adding, "I wish and intend that you be obeyed in all things and everywhere, and that next to me you should be head of my council." It was because Marie so favored the house of Austria that negotiations were begun to arrange a marriage between Louise XIII and Anne of Austria, the eldest daughter of the King of Spain. After some difficulties, the wedding took place. Although the bridegroom was at that time only 14 and the bride 11, and both were expected to remain in the schoolroom a year or two longer, they were nevertheless henceforth husband and wife, as well as king and queen of great Rome. For some mysterious reason, however, Louis XIII was never on a very friendly footing with his beautiful young wife. End of section 77.
Section 78 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 78. The Rule of Favorites. During the 7 years of the king's minority, the Concinis gradually became so arrogant that none of the other nobles could endure them. In 1617, therefore, a great conspiracy was formed. The nobles finally persuaded the king that his marshal was a traitor, so, by Louis XIII's order, Concinis was murdered the very next time he entered the palace. As soon as he was dead, the conspirators rushed into the royal presence, crying triumphantly, "Sire, now you are indeed king, for the marshal is dead." When the cold-blooded young monarch heard these welcome tidings, we are told he deliberately stepped up to the open window and called out joyfully to the assassins, thank you, now I am king." Not content with ridding himself of Concinis by a base murder, the king had the marshal's wife arrested, under pretext that she was practicing magic arts or witchcraft. During her trial, when asked to reveal what spells she had used to keep the queen mother so submissive to her will, Leonora truthfully declared, "Mine has been merely the mastery of a strong mind over a weak one." But the judges utterly refused to credit this simple explanation. They fully shared the popular belief that magic arts had been employed, and for that reason sentenced the poor woman to death as if she had been a common witch. Not only did the nobles thus bring about the disgrace of both Concinis, but they also discredited the queen mother, who was shortly after banished to Blois. She withdrew thither, saying bitterly, "Poor me! I have reigned 7 years, and now can expect nothing more than a crown in heaven." The 30 Years' War having broken out in 1618 between the Catholics and the Protestants in Germany, there was danger that a similar struggle would be renewed in France. The Huguenots desired to make La Rochelle the center of a Protestant republic in France, which, of course, could not be allowed, and war resulted between the two parties. Taking advantage of the disturbed state of affairs, the queen mother and her second son, Gaston of Orleans, began to plot against the king. Marie effected an escape from the castle of Blois through a window, joined a party of disaffected nobles, and fought one battle. But her quarrel with her eldest son soon ended, a reconciliation took place, and mother and son again appeared in public on apparently friendly terms. Meantime, Louis XIII was almost entirely under the influence of another favorite, de Luynes, the man who trained his best hunting hawks, and who had been most instrumental in rousing his suspicions against the Concinis. But although this man was so ambitious as to aspire to the first place at court, he was not capable of governing well, and was soon obliged to yield to Richelieu, who from 1624 to 1642 was the real and very able ruler of France. Richelieu was a remarkably clever man. One of his contemporaries said of him, "God seems to have set no bounds to his intellect." Besides that, he was patriotic and ambitious, his plan being to subdue the Protestants and prevent their setting up a separate state in France, to diminish the power of the nobles, and to weaken the influence of Austria in Europe. In order to bring these 3 desirable things to pass, Richelieu set to work with great skill. The year after he became prime minister, he negotiated a marriage between the king's sister Henrietta and Charles I, thereby securing the alliance of England. Next, he induced Louis XIII to enact severe laws against dueling, which had become so frequent by this time that challenges were exchanged on the slightest pretext. The penalty for the infringement of this law was henceforth rigidly enforced, and some of the greatest nobles of the realm died on the scaffold. To suppress the Protestants, Richelieu next called forth all the military and naval power of the realm, and set off in person to superintend the siege of La Rochelle, the Huguenot stronghold. He surrounded it by troops on the land side, and tried to blockade it by the fleet on the water side, but he soon discovered that it would be impossible to hinder the Germans and English from smuggling in supplies, and he knew that as long as ships could enter the port, the people of La Rochelle would be able to defy the king's authority. Richelieu therefore planned and built a tremendous mole, or dike, across the entrance to the port to prevent supplies from reaching the rebels. The prime minister had proclaimed on starting out for the siege of La Rochelle, "I will employ all the authority the king will give me to ruin the Huguenot party," and, as you see, he certainly made the best use of his power for that purpose. Still, the Huguenots were quite as determined not to yield, and the mayor of La Rochelle assumed office only on condition that he should be empowered to stab the first man who mentioned the word surrender. We are told that the dagger with which to commit this deed always lay on the council table, and that once, when someone ruefully remarked that soon no one would be left to defend the city, this mayor sternly exclaimed, "Even if only one man remains, that man must keep the gate shut." As long as provisions from abroad could reach La Rochelle, the siege proved endurable, but after Richelieu's mole was complete and no more supplies could enter, dire famine set in. The inhabitants were therefore forced to surrender at the end of 15 months, having suffered unheard of hardships before finally giving in. Although conquered, the Huguenots were granted civil equality and liberty to practice their religion by a new peace, Alais, 1629. But they now ceased to form a separate armed political party in France. They were, besides, strictly forbidden to emigrate to Canada, lest their influence there should become too strong in time, and they should form a state in the New World hostile to the Kingdom of France. End of section 78. Section 79 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 79, Richelieu and Louis XIII. Although Louis XIII was of a very cold nature, and seemed as a rule satisfied to let Richelieu manage just as he pleased, the king occasionally showed signs of being jealous of his prime minister, and of wishing to retain the power in his own hands. On one occasion, for instance, when a question of precedence arose, the king bitterly remarked to Richelieu, pass on, for you are the first here." Whereupon Richelieu, with quick tact, rejoined, "Yes, sire, but it is only in order to show the way to your majesty," taking up a candlestick at the same time and preceding the king as if he had been nothing more than his master's lackey. It was thus that Richelieu, the proudest of men, knew how to humble himself to reach his ends, for he had a very strong will, and described himself accurately when he once said, "I undertake nothing without mature consideration, but when I have made up my mind, I mow down everything that stands in my way, and then cover it all up with my red robe." In speaking of his red robe, Richelieu referred to his position as a cardinal in the church, for cardinals wore red robes in public. It was because he was a cardinal, and as such was addressed as Your Eminence, that he was known at court as His Red Eminence. On the other hand, his stern confessor, Brother Joseph, who knew all his secrets, and to whom delicate missions were often entrusted, wore the gray Capuchin garb, and was known as His Gray Eminence, for the courtiers, feeling that he influenced in many ways the master they hated, feared and disliked him equally. Shortly after the Huguenots had been finally subdued, Louis XIII and Richelieu set out to make war against Savoy, an ally of Austria and Spain, with which France was no longer on friendly terms. The young king distinguished himself greatly in an engagement in the Alps, and the war was ended by a treaty giving France the right of free passage over the mountains. After thus reaping laurels in war, Richelieu and the king quietly went on carrying out the great minister's various schemes to humble the nobles, by greatly diminishing the number of feudal fortresses and compelling the aristocracy to respect and obey all the laws of the country. Even the decree against dueling was severely enforced in all cases, Hence it was natural that the nobility in general should dislike the prime minister, but he invariably triumphed over their repeated attempts to oust him from power. On one occasion, taking advantage of the king's brief illness, the queen mother, the queen, and the nobles all eagerly plotted to banish the detested Richelieu. They obtained the king's reluctant consent to send him away, and openly rejoiced when Richelieu packed up his belongings and prepared to leave. But then the minister decided that it might be wise to have a parting interview with his royal master. No one knows exactly what took place at this meeting, but when it was over, Richelieu was fully reinstated in power, the king saying with more warmth than was usual with him, "Continue to serve me as you have done hitherto, and I will defend you against those who have sworn your ruin." The day on which the hopes of both queens and courtiers were so badly frustrated is therefore known in history as the Day of the Dupes (1630). The next plot resulted in a second banishment of the queen mother, Marie de' Medici, who died at Cologne 11 years later, in exile and poverty, in the very house once occupied by the painter Rubens, whom she had employed to decorate her palace of the Luxembourg. The sumptuous edifice had been begun shortly after her husband's death, for she intended to retire to it when her term of regency was over. Her elaborate bedroom can still be seen there, but the pictures which Rubens painted of the various striking events in her life are now in the Louvre, where they give a good idea not only of this great painter's style, but also of this queen's extreme vanity. One of them is shown on page 304 of this book. Louis XIII. Showed great wisdom when he decided to retain the services of Richelieu, for it was mostly owing to this minister's genius that France soon became so prosperous and powerful. Many of the rulers fully realized that the progress of France was mainly due to the cardinal. A century later, Peter the Great of Russia once exclaimed, "I would give half my dominions for a Richelieu to teach me how to govern the other half." Meantime, the 30 Years' War in Germany had been dragging wearily on. First one country and then another helped the German Protestants in their struggle against the Emperor and his Catholic allies. But for a long time Richelieu took no part in the contest, except to send funds secretly when necessary. In the final period of the war, however, lasting from 1635 to 1648, France entered openly into the conflict, Richelieu's aim being to secure what he called the natural frontiers of France, for he had fully decided that, "just as far as Gaul reached, so far shall France extend." In order to obtain these so-called natural frontiers, Richelieu wished to extend the French king's territory to the very banks of the Rhine, and during the war in which he now zealously engaged, he helped to do so by securing possession of Alsace (1639) and of Artois (1640). Richelieu could do no more than one thing at a time. It was in 1637, in the very midst of the last period of the 30 Years' War, that he struck another blow in his efforts to diminish the power of nobles. This he did by instituting the office of intendant, officers whose duty it was to watch over the government of the different provinces, so as to see that everything was done according to the laws of the country and the wishes of the king. End of section 79. Section 80 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 80. End of Louis XIII's reign. One great difficulty during most of this reign was that the king had no sons, and that his brother Gaston of Orleans, assuming that he and his children would some day occupy the throne, was inclined to presume upon these expectations. For many years after the king was married, he and his wife, Anne of Austria, were never on really good terms and generally lived apart, a state of affairs tending, of course, to foster Gaston's hopes of succession. But during a severe illness, Louis XIII experienced a sudden change of heart and was reconciled to his wife. 23 years after their marriage, she gave him the son destined to be famous as Louis XIV. The birth of this child, such a bitter disappointment to Gaston of Orleans, was a source of intense satisfaction to Richelieu, who had never liked Gaston, and was most anxious that the crown should never fall into his hands. During Richelieu's sway, many great reforms were effected in the army and navy in France. Besides, Richelieu succeeded not only in extending the frontiers in the north, but also in conquering Roussillon in the south from the Spanish in 1642. While he was at the front in this campaign, another conspiracy was hatched against him, headed by young noblemen, Cinq-Mars and de Thou, who were executed in spite of their youth and high position. Now, the great cardinal had never been strong, and all through this last campaign had suffered greatly. By the time it was over, he was so weak that he could only travel in a litter. This was shaped like a small bedroom, with space beside the couch for a table and chair, so that a secretary could sit beside him even while traveling, and write down the letters and orders he incessantly dictated. Perceiving that his end was near at hand, Cardinal Richelieu calmly made all his preparations for death, and when the last sacrament was brought into his chamber, solemnly cried, "Here is my judge, who will soon pronounce my sentence. I heartily pray that I may be condemned if I have ever had other intentions than the welfare of the religion and of the state." When asked whether he forgave his enemies, Richelieu haughtily answered, "I have no enemies, save those who are enemies of France." We are also told that in his last interview with his master, Richelieu said, "Sire, I now bid you a final farewell in this world. In taking leave of your Majesty, I behold your kingdom more powerful than ever, and your enemies vanquished." It was then, too, that he designated Mazarin, one of his helpers, as the most capable man to continue the work which he had carried on so ably during the past 18 years. In his will, Richelieu left his palace, afterwards famous as the Palais Royal, to his master. He also bequeathed an extensive library to the city of Paris, and has the honor of being the founder of the famous French Academy, of establishing the Botanical Garden (Jardin des Plantes), and of rebuilding the Sorbonne, where his beautiful tomb can still be seen. Although Louis XIII. Upheld Richelieu loyally against the manifold cabals of the nobles, he received the news of his minister's death very coldly, merely remarking, "A great politician is gone." Even on the day of the funeral, seeing that the weather was very stormy, he only said, "The cardinal has bad weather for his last journey." These unfeeling comments upon the death of a man who had given 18 years to his service and to that of his country show how very unsympathetic this king could be. Louis XIII. Did not long survive the death of the prime minister who had made his reign so famous. When about to pass away in his turn, he made arrangements that his wife, Anne of Austria, should rule in the name of his 4-year-old son. The latter, having been privately baptized, was now officially christened, and was then taken to his dying father, who inquired gently, "What is your name, my child?" The small boy, who had evidently heard some court gossip, promptly replied, "My name is Louis XIV." "No, no, my son, not yet," answered the dying father, "but pray God that it may soon be so." Shortly after, when the king had fallen asleep, a servant bade this little prince gaze again at his father, saying, "My lord, look at the king sleep, so that you may remember him when you are older." Louis XIII. Left life without regret, for one of his last remarks was, "God be praised, I believe that it is now time to take leave of all I love." His one pleasure having been the chase, he had built an extensive hunting lodge on the site of the present palace of Versailles, where the woods were well stocked with game. During Louis XIII.'s reign, Saint Vincent de Paul, who is known as the Steward of Providence and the Apostle of Charity, started the first foundling asylum in Paris, founded the well-known community of the Sisters of Charity, and organized many other charitable works for which he is well known. Great men of letters were particularly favored during this reign by Richelieu. He delighted in reading the productions of Corneille and Descartes, who, together with many others, were just beginning to make a name for themselves, and thanks to whom the reign of Louis XIV. Was to prove one of the most brilliant epochs which France had yet seen. End of section 80. Section 81 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The History of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 81. The Beginning of a Great Reign. Louis XIII having died, 1643, before his son and heir was 5 years old, Anne of Austria was immediately proclaimed regent as the king's will provided. The remainder of the will was, however, utterly disregarded, one of the queen mother's first moves being to take the young king to the Parliament of Paris to have some of its measures annulled. Little Louis XIV is said to have behaved in the most creditable fashion on this occasion, standing very still on a high stool, and holding out his hand to be kissed with the utmost gravity and decorum. While the queen was nominally at the head of affairs, the royal authority was really directed by Cardinal Mazarin, the man whom Richelieu designated as most capable to carry on his work. An Italian of rather common extraction, unable to express himself in French without betraying his foreign origin, Mazarin was equally despised and hated by the courtiers, many of whom fancied they should have had the privilege of ruling in the regent's name. To overcome their opposition and secure his own ends, Mazarin cleverly used both flattery and diplomacy. It was because of his smooth and insinuating manner that the courtiers slyly said, "After the lion comes the fox." Richelieu, of course, was the lion, for he had opposed them openly, and had never tried to conciliate them by flattery or concession, as did the sly fox, Cardinal Mazarin. It was mainly by his artful ways that Mazarin won the queen's favor, and gained complete influence over her. Still, clever as Mazarin was, he made one great mistake, for he sorely neglected the education of the little king, who should have had every advantage. Thus he left him until his 7th year to the care of women, and then abruptly turned him over to that of men, who knew little about children, and hence did not succeed in either entertaining or instructing him. Nevertheless, the child showed fine aptitudes, and an intense pride which evidently formed the basis of his character, and which, if properly directed, would have made him greater than he ever became. When the history of his country was first read aloud to him, Louis XIV's youthful ambitions were so greatly fired that he boldly announced he was going to emulate Charlemagne, Saint Louis, and Francis I. And he flew into a terrible rage when someone reproved him for being lazy by comparing him to Louis the Slothful, one of the do-nothing kings. Mazarin's neglect of the young king's comfort and education arose mainly from innate stinginess. He cut down expenses to such an extent, we are told, that he would allow Louis XIV only 2 pairs of sheets a year, saying that if they were washed once every 6 months it would be quite enough, as laundering was very expensive. With a miserly prime minister and a weak and vain mother, Louis XIV received most of his training from his devoted valet, who was so impressed by his master's position and dignity that he insisted upon the boy's behaving like a king at all times. Once, when the young monarch, in a playful mood, began to wrestle, this man suddenly sat down and put on his hat, 2 things which were never allowed in the presence of the sovereign. This unusual conduct on the part of the generally respectful attendant so startled and mystified the young prince that he paused abruptly in his play to demand haughtily what it might mean, whereupon the valet, resuming his wonted bearing, instantly replied, "Pardon, sire, I did not realize that the king was in the room." As the queen was known to be pleasure-loving, easy-going, and gentle, her brother-in-law Gaston and the other nobles eagerly clustered around her, flattering her in every way, and begging gifts and favors which she freely showered upon them. Indeed, such were the benefits they then received, and such their greedy hopes for the future, that they kept singing the regent's praises, until someone maliciously suggested that there were only 5 words left in the French language, namely the oft-heard phrase, "The queen is so good." Louis XIV's reign had begun when the French period of the 30 Years' War was just at its height, and it was on the very day of his coronation that the Battle of Rocroi took place, 1643. In this memorable encounter, the French general, later known as the Great Cond6, who was then only 22 years old, won a brilliant victory over the Spaniards. But the fame resulting from this triumph so completely turned his youthful head that he soon after joined a conspiracy formed by some nobles, who were of the opinion that they alone should advise the queen in Mazarin's stead. At the head of the conspirators was the fiery Duke of Beaufort, a grandson of Henry IV., who planned nothing less than the murder of Mazarin. But while Beaufort was brave, he was not cautious. So Mazarin, having discovered the plot, had this leader locked up in the fortress of Vincennes, where he had to remain in close confinement until he effected a romantic escape 5 years later. Meantime, the 30 Years' War went on, and Cond6, again in command, helped to win the Battle of Freiburg, 1644, where many brave Frenchmen lost their lives. This evidently did not trouble the young general, for when his attention was called to the fact, he carelessly retorted, "Why, Paris alone daily supplies France with as many men as we have lost during all these encounters." Though he did not feel for his men, Cond6 could nevertheless inspire them to do great deeds. In this battle, for instance, it was reported that he suddenly threw his staff of command into a trench ahead of him, bidding his men follow and help recover it, which they did. The next year, Cond6 fought another famous battle, Nordlingen, and in 1646 he besieged and took Dunkirk, a very important port on the Channel. But he was not the only famous general in France at that time. Turenne was equally noted for bravery, and shared with Cond6 the glory of his great victories. Besides, Turenne waged by himself a brilliant and successful campaign in Bavaria. The war had lasted so long, and the losses had been so great, that the enemy were now weary of warfare. Not long after another victory by Cond6 at Laon, the 30 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. This treaty not only secured France in her recent conquests, but assured the independence of both Holland and Switzerland. Besides, it placed France again at the head of nations, and for 150 years thereafter served as the basis of common law in Europe. End of section 81. Section 82 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 82. The Wars of the Fronde. Meantime, great changes had been taking place in France, where the aristocracy was now everything, and where the lower classes not only had no influence, but were said, "not even to possess their own souls." The long war had proved so expensive that taxes had greatly increased, and loans could now be obtained only by paying exorbitant interest, a state of affairs which, by adding to the nation's already heavy burdens, fostered much discontent. In 1648, therefore, the very year that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, civil war broke out in France. The people and the Parliament of Paris began vehemently to oppose the court. This conflict is known as the Fronde because the rebels acted like the Paris ragamuffins who, armed with slings, frondes, pelted passers-by in the suburbs with stones, but scattered and fled whenever the guard turned out to call them to account for such misbehavior. The First War of the Fronde broke out immediately after an attempt on the Queen's part to awe the Parliament by arresting Broussel, a member who strongly advocated more liberty for the people than the court approved. But the Parisians, on learning of his arrest, threw up barricades in the streets and angrily demanded Broussel's release. Their spokesman having failed to secure it the first time he went to the palace, the angry mob would have torn him to pieces had he not coolly reminded them that they would gain nothing by it. On returning to the Tuileries again, this clever man obtained what he wished from the queen regent by pointing to the little king, then playing in the yard, and warning her gravely, "Madam, that child is losing his crown." Still, the trouble did not end with Broussel's release, for several of the discontented nobles gladly seized this opportunity to rebel, and helped the people and Parliament. They were joined by the Duke of Beaufort, and the disturbance became so alarming that the court soon fled from Paris, taking refuge at Saint-Germain, where nothing had been prepared for its coming. It was customary in those days to travel with bed, bedding, kitchen utensils, etc., and as in the hurry of departure nothing of the sort had been provided, the royal party had to suffer all manner of hardships. The king, in particular, felt these privations so keenly that he took a strong dislike to Saint-Germain. Having escaped in safety from the capital, the queen took prompt measures to suppress the Fronde, and ordered Cond6 to blockade Paris. Several skirmishes occurred between the royal troops and the rebels before an agreement was reached, which put an end to what is known as the Parliamentary or Old Fronde (1649). Although checked for the present, civil war was not at an end. Next year broke out what is known as the Fronde of the Princes, or Young Fronde, in which the principal nobles took part. Cond6 himself headed the faction, though jealously of Mazarin, but was promptly arrested, and during his captivity in Vincennes beguiled long hours by cultivating carnations, of which he was very proud. His friends, however, raised so large an army against Mazarin that the unpopular minister was obliged to flee from Paris. In the midst of the excitement, a rumor spread that the court also had again secretly left the city, carrying off the little king. At this report, the people became frantic, and crowded around the palace, clamoring for a sight of their sovereign, to make sure he was still in their midst. The queen tried to pacify the mob, but perceiving that her efforts were vain, she persuaded the little king, who was already in bed, to feign sleep, and then admitted a certain number of the rioters, bidding them file noiselessly through the royal bedchamber, and satisfy themselves that, as they had been assured, Louis was there, wrapped in slumber. The king, then 12 years old, pretended to sleep while these Parisians gazed their fill upon him. But the vivid impression left by the clamors of the mob, and this night invasion of the palace, were never effaced from his mind, and helped to determine him, when older, to take up his abode outside of the tumultuous capital. Released from prison, Cond6 now sought more and more power, but finding to his disgust that Mazarin's influence still prevailed at court, he resumed his plots with other nobles, and began open rebellion against the royal party. The king and his mother left Paris, and presently summoned Mazarin to their assistance. Returning toward the capital, the youthful king was taken by Mazarin to witness the one great battle of the Young Fronde. This encounter took place just outside one of the gates of Paris, in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where Turenne, at the head of the royal troops, encountered Cond6, leading the rebels. Such was the activity that Cond6 displayed on this memorable occasion, that Turenne admiringly exclaimed, "I have not seen one Cond6 today, I have seen more than 12 of them." In spite of all this energy, Cond6 would have been sorely worsted in this battle had not the daughter of Gaston, Mademoiselle de Montpensier, mounted to the top of the Bastille, and thence boldly directed the king's cannon upon the royal troops, thus checking their advance. This lady, although several years older than Louis XIV., and his cousin besides, had been most anxious to become Queen of France, as Mazarin well knew. By siding thus openly with the royal foes on this occasion, however, she forfeited her last chance of winning a crown. As Mazarin put it, "By that cannon shot she killed her husband." Now Mazarin knew that the nobles were united only by their dislike of him, and that the Spaniards had been invited to take part in the war under pretext of ousting him from office. He therefore advised the queen to banish him from court a second time, and patiently waited for the princes to quarrel among themselves. No sooner had this come to pass than he returned in triumph. The Parliament of Paris soon submitted, the nobles returned to their allegiance, and the court came back to Paris, where the king was warmly welcomed, but where Mazarin continued to be greatly disliked. Instead of making open war, however, his foes now vented their spite by writing and publishing lampoons against him, which were known as Mazarinades, a name now generally applied to political satires. Cond6, the only nobleman who refused to submit, went off to join the forces of Spain in Flanders, where Turenne faced him in several small encounters, and finally defeated him in the great battle of the Downs, near Dunkirk. Knowing the obstinacy and incapacity of his Spanish troops, Cond6 felt sure beforehand that there was no hope of winning a victory on this occasion. So he remarked to a bystander, "Were you ever in a battle, my lord?" "No," was the answer. "Well, then, in the course of the next half hour, you will see us lose one." Shortly after this battle, the Treaty of the Pyrenees (1659) ended the war between France and Spain. It left France in possession of her conquests, but provided that the great Cond6 should be pardoned and restored to his offices. It also settled the king's marriage, as we shall see later on. End of section 82.
Section 83 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 83. Death of Mazarin. Louis XIV. Is noted for having been very handsome in his youth, with a profusion of curling golden hair, which he wore long, a style his courtiers promptly imitated, resorting to wigs, perruques, when nature did not provide them with sufficiently luxuriant locks. Owing to an illness which left him nearly bald in youth, Louis XIV. Also wore wigs, which became larger and curlier as time went on. All the portraits of the day, therefore, show us smooth or moustached faces, fairly embedded in clustering curls, which only experienced hairdressers could keep in order. Besides natural good looks, Louis had also charming manners, on which he greatly prided himself. His courtiers related with bated breath that he even took off his hat to a chambermaid, if he happened to meet one on his way. Not only did Louis's courtesy win him many friends, but it was imitated by all around him, the nobles in particular striving to become as polite and dignified as their king. Thus grand manners became the rule at court and in all fashionable assemblies in France. Louis XIV., at an early age, began to show great fondness for female society, and soon fell desperately in love with one of Mazarin's nieces. The cardinal realized that a king of France must contract a royal alliance, so he promptly broke up this love affair by sending his niece away. When the young king heard that his lady-love was to leave court, he was broken-hearted, but the damsel hotly reproached him for his idle tears at parting, exclaiming indignantly, "You are king, and do nothing but weep, so I must go away." Mazarin hoped for a marriage between Louis XIV. And Maria Theresa, one of the Spanish princesses or infantas, and in the Treaty of the Pyrenees he secured an agreement to bring this about. He then hastened to the queen mother's room, announcing triumphantly, "Madam, we have both peace and the Infanta," for he knew how greatly such tidings would please Anne of Austria, who had bewailed the long quarrel with Spain. But before the marriage could be concluded, the young Spanish princess had to renounce all right to the Spanish crown, that is to say, promise that neither she nor her children would ever claim it. Mazarin, however, shrewdly arranged that this renunciation should be valid only in case the queen's huge dowry were paid in full, and as the Spanish court failed to pay, this promise was considered invalid later on. When all had been settled, the court proceeded in state to the frontier to welcome the new queen, and the marriage was celebrated when the king was only 20 years old. Though Louis's young wife was undeniably handsome, he never felt great interest in her, and soon began to neglect her, thus setting a pernicious example to his court and people. Mazarin, who steered the ship of state so cleverly through the troubled waters occasioned by the end of the 30 Years' War and the Fronde, somewhat neglected French finances, navy, and commerce during the 19 years of his ministry. But this neglect was not wholly intentional, for he was generally anxious to do his best for his adopted country, and often said, "My heart is French, though my language is not." Many interesting anecdotes are related about him. For instance, when pressed for time, Mazarin once promised to give audience to one of the many petitioners constantly besieging his door, if the man would make known his wants in 2 words. As soon as admitted, this man stared at the cardinal, then at the fire, and gasped, "Cold! Hungry!" With ready wit, Mazarin rejoined, "Fire! Bread!" and dismissed the petitioner after bestowing upon him a pension sufficient for his immediate needs. Mazarin was a great lover of letters and art, and during his lifetime accumulated considerable wealth and many art treasures, including a number of pictures by the old masters. He was so fond of these masterpieces that on learning his end was near, he had them all brought to him in turn, and took leave of them, saying, "Farewell, dear pictures, that I have loved so dearly, and that have cost me so much." Then he arranged that the majority of them should always remain in France, and many of the art treasures now in the Louvre are due to him. In his last talk with his young king, the prime minister gave him good advice, saying impressively, "Sire, know how to respect yourself, and you will be respected. Never have a prime minister, but employ Colbert whenever you require the assistance of an adviser at once intelligent and devoted." A few moments later he added, "I owe you everything, sire, but I believe I am cancelling my obligations to your majesty by giving you Colbert." Mazarin is also known as the founder of a fine library, and of the College of the Four Nations, as well as for having annexed to France 3 important provinces, Artois, Alsace, and Roussillon. End of section 83.
Section 84 of the Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 84. Versailles. Mazarin was dead. The strong hand which had guided affairs of state so long had dropped from the helm, and the subordinate ministers, not knowing what to do, turned in bewilderment to Louis XIV, asking, "To whom shall we apply henceforth for orders?" Louis XIV, then just 22, mindful of Mazarin's last recommendations, drew himself up and quietly answered, "To me." The king was ambitious and persevering, duly impressed by his important position, and determined to practice faithfully what he himself termed his trade as king. He therefore set immediately to work, and for 54 years labored regularly 8 hours a day at his self-imposed task, presiding over every council, deciding every matter in person, and not allowing any paper to leave the palace without his approval. As Louis' natural abilities were far above the average, this close attention to business bore good fruit. People soon began to see the truth of Mazarin's statements. There is in him stuff enough for 4 kings and for 1 honest man. And he may start out late, but he will go farther than anyone else. This prediction's time was to verify, for the reign of Louis XIV proved the most glorious as well as the longest in French history. From the death of Mazarin, 1661, until his own death, 1715, Louis had no prime minister, but personally exercised the chief authority in the country. Because everything centered thus in him, He too, as well as Francis I, see page 244, is often considered the founder of absolute monarchy in France, or of the system generally known as the Old Regime. Indeed, it is even said that Louis XIV once declared, "I am the state. L'État, c'est moi." His first speech on assuming the government was, "Gentlemen, I have called you together to tell you that up to the present day I have been willing to allow the deceased cardinal to regulate my affairs. Hereafter I intend to be on my own prime minister. You will aid me by your counsels whenever I shall ask for them, and I beg and command you, Mr. Chancellor, not to seal any documents save by my orders, and you, my Secretary of State and Superintendent of Finances, never to sign anything save by my orders." Louis XIV was so arbitrary because he believed in the divine right of kings, and because he was also firmly convinced that it is the will of God that he who is born a subject should obey and make no question. His overweening opinion of his own position and intelligence helped to make him a great historical figure, but later on led also to disaster. Because he had been frightened by the riots of the Fronde in his early childhood, Louis did not wish to settle in Paris, and because the palaces in the neighborhood, Fontainebleau, Saint-Germain, etc., bore too clearly the imprint of previous kings, he resolved to transform his father's modest hunting castle at Versailles into a dwelling worthy of himself. In 1661, therefore, the construction of the present palace was begun. The work was planned by famous architects, the ceilings and walls decorated by the best painters of the day, the gardens laid out by a famous landscape gardener, and adorned with statues by noted sculptors. Water in profusion to feed the many fountains and artificial lakes was brought from a distance. Fruit-grown trees were transplanted from remote forests, and everything was done to create an abode which all the other sovereigns envied and sought to copy, and which served in a way as a model for the construction of countless other edifices in Europe. To accomplish all this in a barren plain required a host of workmen, as well as a mint of money. But the king considered nothing but his pleasure. From 1661 to 1710, additions and extensions were constantly made to Versailles, until the palace became one of the show places of the world. The cost of all this magnificence has been estimated at about $400 million of our money today. So you can readily imagine that it is a place which must be seen if one wishes to have any conception of its extent and beauty. The creation of Louis XIV, it bears at every turn the imprint of his taste. But since 1837, it has been a national museum, open to all, and has been filled with priceless treasures of art in addition to those secured by its founder. In this palace, there were apartments for all the members of the royal family, with quarters for their suites, guards, and attendants, besides lodgings for the principal officers of the court, and for the guests and favorites of royalty. Nobles who were not lodged there built villas and palaces in the neighborhood, so as to be able to appear daily at court. For if nobles failed to pay frequent homage to the king, he was apt to remark coldly when their names were mentioned, "I do not know them." The French court took up its abode in Versailles in 1682, and for the next century this palace was not only the home of the king, but also the center of government in France. It may interest you to hear how Louis XIV spent his days in this ideal residence, and to learn what etiquette ruled his court. The first thing in the morning, the doors were flung wide open to admit the waiting crowd of courtiers. These were the grand entries, grandes entrées, when all who wished to see the king flocked into an antechamber known as the Bull's Eye, œil de bœuf, on account of its oval window. His special favorites were thence admitted to the king's bedroom to witness his morning toilet, petit lever. As soon as this was over, the king, richly clad, emerged to greet the waiting throng, and, attended by an obsequious court, proceeded to chapel to hear mass. After service, he was escorted back in state to the room where he gave audience to those waiting to confer with him, before presiding over his council. Being very punctual himself, Louis always insisted upon great promptness, and once, when one of his ministers entered the council room by another door, just as he appeared, he haughtily remarked, "Sir, I almost had to wait." It was customary for the king to eat his 1 o'clock dinner in state. He sat alone at a table under the royal canopy, while the various members of the royal family, the princes, and invited guests dined at other tables. During this meal, anyone, if clean and neatly dressed, was allowed to pass through the hall to gaze at the king, and the courtiers made it a point to be in attendance for the king's brother, or in case of his absence, the next in rank had the exalted privilege of handing Louis XIV his napkin. After dinner, the crowd followed the king down the great staircase to the beautiful grounds for an afternoon walk, the gentlemen being granted permission to don their hats, until then held in the hand or tucked under the arm by a gracious gesture and the words, "Your hats, gentlemen." After a walk, drive, or hunt, for the sake of sociability and exercise, the king was again closeted with his ministers, and the busy day was followed by a concert, play, or ball. The sumptuous royal supper, to which the king invited any guest he pleased, was always served at 10 o'clock. At bedtime, after taking ceremonious leave of the main part of his courtiers in the antechamber, the king was solemnly escorted to his room by a select few, and one courtier was finally allowed each evening to hold the royal candlestick while his majesty said his prayers and climbed into bed. All day long the Versailles courtiers vied with one another in attentions to the king and to the court ladies, conversing gaily and exchanging witty remarks. In fact, life at court was so brilliant that the worst disgrace which could befall a member of the aristocracy was to incur royal displeasure and to be banished from Versailles. There was, therefore, no extravagance that lords and ladies were not ready to commit to win the king's attention or favor, and no flattery too fulsome to be lavished upon him. One courtier, walking with the king in the gardens of Marly, and overtaken there by a shower, was heard to assure his master, "Ah, sire, Marly rain does not wet." When Louis became old and complained that he had no teeth, A young lord, though himself well supplied with them, boldly exclaimed, "Ah, sire, who is there, then, that has any teeth?" Even a cook committed suicide because the fish one day did not arrive in time for the king's dinner. End of section 84. Section 85 of the Story of Old Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Old Friends by H. A. Guerber. Section 85. The Iron Mask. As we have seen, Louis began his independent reign by proceeding to supervise everything himself, but his principal adviser was Guerber, who had served Mazarin, and was therefore well posted about all government matters. Guerber soon informed the young monarch that there was something amiss in regard to Fouquet, Minister of Finance, who, beginning his duties as a poor man, was at the end of a few years noted for great wealth. At first the king would not credit such tales, but before Mazarin had been in his grave many months, Fouquet's stealings became too glaring to be ignored, and his fall came about in a dramatic way. It seems that Fouquet once invited the king to his country home, where the great magnificence of his establishment eclipsed everything that had hitherto been seen at court. Louis XIV, who expected to be first in everything, gazed around him in wondering displeasure, and showed his wrath by remarking coldly, "I shall never again, sir, venture to invite you to visit me, for you would find yourself inconvenienced." Still apparently polite and well entertained, Louis soon came to the conclusion that all this wealth could not have been obtained by honest means. It is possible, however, that Fouquet would only have been deprived of office, had not the king discovered that his dishonest minister dared to rival him in another line. Louis had recently begun to pay court to a beautiful young lady, Mademoiselle de la Vallière, over whose graceful head he once at a picnic held his plumed hat to protect her from a summer shower. The king's infatuation was no secret, so no one else ventured to pay this lady attentions, for fear of arousing royal jealousy. It is said, however, that Fouquet, also smitten with this fair lady's charms, secreted her portrait in a private room, where it was closely covered by a curtain, so that the gaze of the vulgar might never rest upon it. By some accident, Louis went into this very apartment, where his attention was naturally attracted by the shrouded painting. Wishing to gratify his curiosity, the king quickly pushed aside the curtain, and so discovered the full extent of his minister's perfidy. In his wrath, the king soon after had Fouquet arrested and confiscated all his possessions. 19 years later, it was publicly reported that Fouquet had died in one of the king's fortresses. But about the same time, a mysterious prisoner was first mentioned in France. This man, evidently some important personage, was treated with great respect by his jailers, but no one was ever allowed to converse privately with him, or even to catch a glimpse of his face, which was always covered by a velvet mask. As this mask was black, it was said to be of iron, and because no name was ever given to this captive, he was popularly known as the Iron Mask. Many stories are told about him, some of which you will like to hear. From one fortress to another, this prisoner traveled through France, each governor being obliged in turn to answer with his life for the man's safe detention. For a time, the Iron Mask was locked up in a tower overlooking the sea, and one day, it is said, he managed to scratch a few words on a silver dish, which he flung through the bars out of his window. A poor fisherman casting his nets in that neighborhood drew up this silver vessel, which he immediately carried to the castle in hopes of securing a rich reward. He obstinately refused, however, to give it up or even to show it to anyone save the governor, who, on catching sight of the words scratched on the smooth silver surface, turned ghastly pale. Finding, however, by close cross questioning, that the fisherman did not know how to read, and had not shown his find to any one, the governor congratulated the man upon his ignorance and caution, grimly declaring that to them he owed his life. In time, the Iron Mask was conveyed to the Bastille in Paris, where he died in 1703, after being, some say, 24 and others 43 years a prisoner. But even then the mystery was not revealed, for we are told that no one was permitted to see the dead man's features. The man in the Iron Mask is one of the great puzzles in history, because no great person is known to have disappeared at that time. There are many theories about him, but as no positive proof exists that any one of these is correct, you may think what you please. Dumas, the great French novelist, romantically asserted that the man with the Iron Mask was a twin brother of Louis XIV, so exactly like him that they could not be told apart. He claimed that this prince was kept in prison lest trouble should arise for the state, but that if anything untoward had happened during Louis XIV's minority, his twin brother would undoubtedly have been put in his place, without anyone suspecting the substitution. Another theory is that this man was Fouquet, although his death had been openly announced, was still made to suffer for having dared to raise his eyes to the king's favorite, if not for having robbed the state. A third supposition, the least romantic but most plausible, is that a secretary of the Duke of Mantua, trying to cheat the French government, was secretly seized and imprisoned by Louis' orders. These are only 3 out of many versions of the story of the mysterious prisoner, to which you will find many allusions both in history and in fiction. End of section 85.
Section 86 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H.A. Guerber. Section 86, Louis XIV's Early Campaigns. The garden party given by the dishonest Fouquet was not the only great outdoor entertainment of the time. About a year after, the court held a fine pageant, called Carrousel, on the square before the Louvre, which ever since has been known by that name. On this occasion a quadrille on horseback was danced by the courtiers, all dressed in the utmost magnificence to represent characters in myth and allegory. Even the king and queen appeared in fancy costume, and Louis, having elected to personate the sun, wore $2,500,000 worth of diamonds, which flashed and glittered so that they won for him the title of King Sun, Le Roi Soleil, by which he was generally known thereafter. This brilliant social event is the subject of a painting which now adorns the picture gallery of Versailles. Being young, the king greatly enjoyed stir and activity, and, anxious to shine in every field, was not at all sorry when a pretext arose for a war with Spain, 1667. You remember, do you not, that Louis had married a Spanish princess? Her father had now just died, leaving all his lands to her little stepbrother, but Louis XIV claimed that while this child undoubtedly had a right to the crown of Spain, he had none whatsoever to the Spanish Netherlands, now Belgium, which by Flemish law should devolve instead upon the children of the first wife. As the Spaniards were not ready to agree to this, war resulted, and Louis went off to join his army, which in a few weeks' time conquered Flanders and Franche-Comté. So little fighting was done, however, in this campaign, that it was playfully said, quote, Louis might have sent his valet to take possession of the country in his name, and saved himself the trouble of going in person. End quote. But if Louis did not have a chance to distinguish himself in battle, he received as many compliments as if he had done wonderful things, and greatly enjoyed his novel experiences. The war of the Devolution of Flanders, which was little more than a military promenade, was concluded by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which added a piece of land to France in the north. It soon led, however, to another conflict with Holland, 1672 to 1678, which was waged partly because Louis's vanity was sorely wounded by the fun the Dutch made of his recent campaign, and partly because the Dutch navy kept interfering with the commerce of France. Once more, King Sun set out at the head of his army, splendidly organized by his war minister Louvois, severely drilled by Martinet and others, whence a strict disciplinarian is still often termed a martinet, and magnificently generaled by the great Condé, Turenne, and others. A tremendous fuss was made at court when news came that the French army had forded the Rhine and had driven away the troops guarding the passage. Poems were written about it, and great speeches made, for stay-at-homes fancied that the king and his army had breasted the waves at the risk of their lives, whereas, in fact, the French had merely forded a shallow part of the stream, almost unopposed by the enemy. Town after town was captured. The Hollanders, unprepared for an invasion, then tried to compromise, and their great statesmen, the De Witt brothers, corresponded actively with Louvois on this subject. In fact, had not the Hollanders suddenly overthrown the existing government, torn the De Witts to pieces, and placed William of Orange at the head of affairs, these negotiations might have resulted favorably. This William of Orange, however, was an excellent and uncompromising leader. When he saw that the French had nearly reached Amsterdam, he did not hesitate to have the dikes broken and flood the country. This move checked the advance of the French, and gave William ample time to secure the alliance of both Spain and Germany to continue the war. When the German princes began to threaten the northeastern frontier of France, Louis changed his plans and for the second time conquered Franche-Comté. In later campaigns, Condé won the Battle of Senef, 1674, over the Prince of Orange, and Turenne, who had done wonders in many smaller engagements, was killed at Sassbach, 1675. The cannonball which killed Turenne carried off at the same time the arm of one of his officers. When this man's son was trying to comfort him, he quickly replied, "You should not weep for me, but for the death of this great man. You may love your father, but neither you nor the country will ever find such a general again." As for the soldiers, when they heard Turenne was dead, they all wailed, "Our father is dead, we're lost!" The general whom they thus almost worshipped was buried first at Saint Denis, among the French kings, and then in a chapel of the Invalides, where his tomb is second in interest only to that of Napoleon. It may interest you to read a few anecdotes about the brave general, who was one of the great French heroes. For instance, Turenne was noted for always keeping his promises. Once, when held up by highwaymen, he begged them not to take a ring he wore, offering to give them more than it was worth if they would only call at his house for the money. When he was freed on these terms, someone suggested that he should use this opportunity to have the thieves arrested, but Turenne indignantly refused, saying, "The promise of an honest man is inviolable. He should never fail to keep his word, even if he did give it to rascals." Another time, when dressed in white, Turenne was vigorously clapped on the shoulder by a valet, who mistook him for the cook. Suddenly perceiving his error, the offender fell down on his knees, gasping, "My lord, I thought you were George." But, instead of the angry dismissal he expected, he heard only the calm rejoinder, "Well, even had I been George, you need not have hit so hard." While Turenne knew the sense of fear, he never yielded to it. Once, when about to mount his horse, he perceived that his knees were shaking violently, and remarked with a queer smile, "If my knees only knew where I am going to take them, they would shake even harder." Besides physical courage, Turenne possessed what is much rarer, true moral courage. Thus, he staunchly refused to fight a duel, simply because it was against the law. When his opponent taunted him with cowardice, Turenne proposed that they should undertake, in common, some perilous adventure for the country's good, saying proudly, "Let us see which of us will best carry it out." In one battle, Turenne noticed that his staff seemed mortified because they could not help ducking when a cannonball whistled over their heads. Always genial and sympathetic, he tactfully cried, "Boys, you are right. Such visitors well deserve a curtsy." Before this war ended, the French admiral Duquesne won several naval battles in the Mediterranean, but received neither praise nor reward for this triumph, simply because he was a Huguenot, a sect not in favor at court. In protesting against such unfair treatment, Duquesne was heard to mutter, "It is true that I am a Protestant, but I thought that my services were Catholic." The Treaty of Nimwegen (1678), which ended the war with Holland, extended the boundaries of France on the north and on the west. It also marked the highest point of the reign of Louis XIV., whom his people thereafter proudly termed Louis the Great, and the Great Monarch, Le Grand Monarque. It was in commemoration of his military feats in this campaign that Louis XIV. Erected two permanent triumphal arches, Porte Saint-Denis and Porte Saint-Martin, in Paris, where they still stand, the admiration of all who behold them. End of section 86. Section 87 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 87. Madame de Maintenon. Thanks to Louis XIV's executive ability and to his famous helpers, Colbert and Louvois, the period from 1674 to 1689 proved most prosperous for France. In fact, the country progressed more in those 15 years than it did in the next 100. After Fouquet's disgrace, Colbert became Minister of Finances and was charged to watch over the commercial, agricultural, and industrial interests of the country. Although it was Colbert's office to supply money enough for the king's wars, buildings, and other extravagances, he earnestly tried to diminish and equalize the taxes and to check a dangerous tendency to borrow money. He also encouraged the planting of flax and cotton and of mulberry trees for the silkworm industry, had roads built, and supplied funds for digging the great canal which connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, Canal de Languedoc. He also founded factories for making cloth, silk, mirrors, tapestry, carpets, lace, etc., and encouraged and protected the French colonies, which until his day had been rather neglected. Colbert faithfully served the king from Mazarin's death until his own in 1683, although his last days were saddened by the knowledge that Louvois had supplanted him in the royal favor. When a letter from the king was handed to him on his deathbed, he refused to read it, saying bitterly, like Wolsey, "I will not hear the king spoken of again. Let me die in peace. It is to the King of Kings I now have to answer. Had I done for God what I have done for that man, I should have found salvation 10 times over, and now I do not know what will become of me." The people wrongly blamed Colbert for the heavy taxes, and hated him so intensely that they would have liked to insult his remains. He therefore had to be buried secretly at night. But he is now generally recognized as the creator of French industry, commerce, navy, and finances. Louvois, of whom the dying Colbert was so jealous, not only reformed the army, but established the famous naval ports of Brest and Toulon, and by diplomatic arts enabled France to take possession of the city of Strasbourg in time of peace without striking a single blow, 1681. For nearly 200 years thereafter, this fortified town belonged to France, and was one of the principal French strongholds of the northeast. The defenses of Strasbourg were greatly strengthened by Vauban, Louis's great military engineer, who is said to have created an iron frontier by repairing 500 old forts and building 55 new ones. He is also said to have been present at 53 sieges, and to have taken part in 143 engagements. His talents were such that French people said, "A city besieged by Vauban is a taken city. A city fortified by Vauban is an impregnable city." Although personally bold to the verge of foolhardiness, Vauban was always careful with his men's lives, and so loyal a Frenchman that he earned the title of patriot. War having ceased at home after the Treaty of Nimwegen, Louis turned his attention to the serious depredations of the Barbary pirates, and put an end to them by sending a fleet to bombard Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, and to liberate the Christian captives detained there in hard slavery. Then, having discovered that the people of Genoa had secretly supplied these pirates with ammunition, Louis next had that city bombarded also, and refused to make peace until the Doge, President of the Republic, came in person to Versailles to apologize. The Constitution of Genoa, however, strictly forbade the Doges leaving this city while in office. So when a courtier asked him what surprised him most among all the wonders he beheld at Versailles, he simply and truthfully answered, "It is to see myself here." Maria Theresa, Louis's queen, died in 1683. Although Louis had not been a good husband, he had always treated her with outward courtesy, and when she had passed away, he said, quote, "God has deprived me of a consort who never gave me any cause for grief except by her death." End quote. She had done her duty by giving her husband a son to inherit the crown, but the court made only a pretense of mourning her death. Tired of favorites, one of whom, Madame de Montespan, had much influence over him for many years, Louis XIV. At last secretly married the governess of his children, Madame de Maintenon, a lady whom the courtiers punningly called Madame de Maintenon, meaning the present madam. She was, however, never openly recognized as queen, although she was often present at the royal council, and the king frequently asked for her opinion, calling her playfully "your solidity" and "your reason." Of noble birth, although extremely poor, Madame de Maintenon had been glad, when only 16, to marry a sickly, hunchback poet, Scarron, who lived only 8 years after their marriage. In his house she proved such a witty and entertaining hostess that all the most noted people came to visit her. Sometimes, when the poor poet's modest table was insufficiently supplied to satisfy the appetites of so many guests, the waiter, knowing his mistress's fascinating arts, would whisper, Another story, please, madam, for the roast is too small today. A woman whose brilliant conversation could make hungry people forget to eat was, of course, able to amuse the old king, who, having tired of everything, was apt to be capricious and easily bored. But as Madame de Maintenon was very devout, she insisted upon Louis being pious too, and encouraged the clergy to appear at court. She also helped to persuade the king that it was his duty to stamp out Protestantism in his realm. You remember, do you not, that ever since the Edict of Nantes, granted by Henry IV., the Protestants had been permitted to hold their form of worship in France? They were still most numerous in the south, and had by this time increased in numbers to such an extent that there were more than 1,000,000 Huguenots in France. Louis XIV. Tried to convert these people, at first by persuasion, and then by force, actually sending dragoons to live in their houses and annoy them until they renounced their religion, a system of persecution which is known as the dragonnade. Next, the king revoked the Edict of Nantes, 1685, decreed that no more Huguenot worship should be permitted in France, ordered that all Protestant ministers should be forced to leave the country, and forbade any other Huguenots to follow them. The result of the dragonnade and of the harsh edict of revocation was that many Protestants perished, about 200,000 escaped, and the rest feigned conversion for the sake of peace. As the Huguenot emigrants were largely of the industrial class, France was greatly impoverished by their loss, while neighboring countries were correspondingly enriched. Lyons, for instance, which had boasted of 18,000 silk looms before the persecution began, had only 4,000 in operation when it was over. Moreover, Protestants everywhere resented the cruel treatment their brethren had suffered in France, so that Louis thus created many bitter enemies abroad. End of section 87. Section 88 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 88. Later Wars of Louis XIV. Louis XIV. Not only paid Charles II. Of England a yearly sum of money to favor French policies, but also encouraged Charles' successor, James II., in his attempts to rule as an absolute monarch and to convert the English to Catholicism. This roused an English revolt. Louis's old foe, William of Orange, crossed over to England, and when James II. Fled, gladly accepted the crown tendered to him and to his wife, a daughter of the deposed king. James naturally turned to Louis for a home during his exile, as well as for means to recover the throne for himself and his infant son, later known in England as the Old Pretender. Thus Louis XIV. Became involved in war with England, while William headed the League of Augsburg against him, having secured the aid of Germany, Spain, Holland, and Sweden. As a result, France waged war 1688 to 1697 against great odds, and this struggle marks the beginning of the great monarch's decline. Until then, Louis had always gone to war in person, but he now sent the Dauphin in his stead, saying, quote, "My son, in sending you to command my armies, I afford you an opportunity of making your merits known. Go, and so act in the face of Europe, that when I am no more, it shall not perceive that the king is dead." End quote. The war was waged on all sides of France at once, and for years we hear of nothing but battles and destruction. The French, for instance, ravaged the Rhine country and ruined many castles there. Then, against England were fought the naval battles of Beachy Head, 1689, La Hogue, 1692, and Cap St. Vincent, 1693, in which the great French admiral Tourville and other sailors won many laurels. But one of these mariners, Jean Bart, showed his great conceit when the king remarked one day, "I wish I had 10,000 men like you," by coolly replying, "I can well believe it, sire." In 1690 a great land battle was fought at Fleurus, where the French general Luxembourg, a hunchback, won a brilliant victory over the Imperialists, capturing many standards which were hung in the church of Notre Dame in Paris. Another victory of his so irritated William of Orange that he angrily exclaimed, "Shall I then never beat this accursed hunchback?" When this exclamation was repeated to Luxembourg, he proudly cried, "Hunchback! What does he know about it? He has never seen my back." He further proved his courage by winning two more battles, Steinkirk (1692) and Nervenden (1693), over this same foe, while Catinat, another famous French general, won a battle in Italy over the Duke of Savoy. In spite of all these victories, the cost of the war proved so great and the losses so heavy that Louis XIV. Was glad to put an end to hostilities by the Treaty of Ryswick (1697), whereby he gave up all his recent conquests, save Strasbourg, and promised no longer to support James II. In his vain attempts to recover the English throne. This Treaty of Ryswick, however necessary to France and acceptable to the rest of Europe, was intensely disappointing to Vauban, who dejectedly said, "We have always beaten the enemy, and yet we make a peace which dishonors the king and the nation." While the war was going on, Louis XIV. Spent most of his time at Versailles, directing everything and working hard on his plans for the erection of the Hôtel des Invalides and of the Louvre Colonnade. His principal recreation consisted in hearing the plays written by Molière, Corneille, and Racine. He also took an interest in helping Madame de Maintenon found Saint-Cyr at the other end of the park of Versailles, a boarding school for the daughters of his officers. The institution now bearing the name Saint-Cyr is for young men only, and furnishes officers for the army. When these damsels left school, their patroness often arranged marriages for them, and even supplied their dowries. Now, as Madame de Maintenon had no money of her own, it was only by interesting the king in this establishment that she could obtain the funds to continue her good work. She therefore asked the poet Racine to write tragedies which the young ladies could play before the king, introducing choruses so that all the pupils could take part at once. As a result of this request, we have the two famous tragedies of Athalie and Esther, based on episodes of Old Testament history, and hence suited to the youthful actresses who first played them. The king, although old, still kept open court, insisting upon the nobles appearing there frequently. Indeed, even elderly peers were not exempt. Once, when the gouty Condé slowly advanced to meet the waiting king, he had to excuse himself by saying, "Sire, I beg your majesty's pardon for keeping you waiting." The king on this occasion graciously replied, "Do not hurry, cousin. When one is so weighted with laurels, one cannot, of course, proceed any faster." To an unfortunate general, broken-hearted at having to capitulate, and fearing the royal wrath, Louis once kindly said, "Marquis, you showed your courage in the defense, and your wisdom in the capitulation." Arbitrary as Louis was, he occasionally showed that he did not object to hearing the truth. Once, for instance, when he insisted upon pardoning a criminal, his chancellor objected, and only upon the king's positive order produced the seals. But when Louis handed them back, the chancellor proudly refused to accept them, declaring they had been defiled. This made the king pause and think, after which he flung the paper he had just sealed into the fire. Delighted at having thus made justice prevail, the chancellor rapturously cried, "I take back the seals, sire, for fire purifies everything." End of section 88. Section 89 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 89. The Spanish Succession. The beginning of the new century, the 18th, was marked by the outbreak of a new war, known in history as the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 through 1713. You must understand clearly how it came to be fought. You remember that at the death of the King of Spain, who was Maria Theresa's father, the King of France had claimed part of his inheritance in the Netherlands. Now the Queen's stepbrother also died, leaving no direct heir to the Spanish crown, but stating in his will that he wished Maria Theresa's second grandson Philip, the Duke of Anjou, to succeed him. The French were delighted to have a prince of France accept this crown, provided it were arranged that France and Spain should never be united. But the other nations, fearing lest such a promise should be disregarded, and one monarch become in time so dangerously strong as to threaten the peace of Europe, opposed the Spanish king's will with all their might. After due consideration, Louis XIV. Bade his young grandson accept the crown offered to him, and announced this decision by presenting him to the French court thus: "Gentlemen, here is the King of Spain." Then he pronounced a famous speech, in which he told the youth to rule wisely and be true to Spain, yet never forget the ties of birth which bound him to France, from which even the Pyrenees could not divide him. This speech gave rise to the oft-quoted grandiloquent saying, "There are no more Pyrenees," or "the Pyrenees have disappeared." By accepting the Spanish king's will, many people claimed that Louis XIV. Had violated his wife's renunciation, but others asserted that, as her dower had never been paid in full, there was nothing binding about this promise. Europe in general, however, rose up in arms against France and Spain. William III. Again headed the League, and its armies were ably led by the two great generals, Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. The latter, it is said, had once offered his services to Louis XIV., only to be scorned on account of his small stature, a mistake that was to cost France dear. Villars, a famous French general, won the battle of Hochstedt, while one of his countrymen won another. Then luck turned, and the Allies gained victories in 3 battles: Blenheim, 1704, Ramillies, and Touraine, 1706. After the second of these engagements, Louis XIV. Comforted his defeated general, Villeroy, by exclaiming, "Mr. Marshal, at our age fortune no longer favors us," alluding, of course, to the popular saying, "Fortune favors the young." The news of these defeats caused great dismay in France, but, confident that they would triumph in the end, the French went on singing a mocking song about Marlborough, which is still familiar in French nurseries today: "Malbrouck s'en va en guerre." Then a victory in Spain, 1707, again raised French spirits, only to be followed the succeeding year by a crushing defeat at Oudenarde in the Netherlands. This was followed by a winter of such unusual severity that the army suffered untold hardships, and Louis XIV. Had to beg for peace. But when the Allies refused to grant it unless he helped drive his own grandson out of Spain, he bravely answered, "Since I must fight, I had rather fight my enemies than my children." The war was therefore renewed, and the French lost the Battle of Malplaquet, 1709. But the next year Louis's grandson, Philip V. of Spain, won a triumph, Villaviciosa, and soon afterwards England withdrew from the struggle, leaving France with one foe less. The year 1712 saw Villars victor at Denain, and in 1713 the Treaty of Utrecht put an end to the War of the Spanish Succession. By this treaty, Philip V. was left in possession of all of Spain, except Gibraltar, and of Spain's colonies in America. The other lands which had once belonged to the Spanish crown, the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, Sicily, and Minorca, now went to various countries, and Louis XIV. Ceded to England the Hudson Bay region, Newfoundland, and Acadia. The 3 great treaties signed during the reign of Louis XIV., Nimwegen, Ryswick, and Utrecht, were unsatisfactory to the German imperialists, who, punning on these Dutch names, said that it had all been a case of take away, tear away, and wrongdoing. Nimweg, Rysweg, and Unrecht. You will not be surprised, after what you have heard about him, to learn that 2 favorite sayings of Louis XIV. Were, self-aggrandizement is the noblest occupation of kings, and kings give by spending. The many wars of his reign, added to his building extravagances, had been steadily running the country deeper and deeper into debt, besides making the taxes heavier and heavier. It was computed that the French nation, then numbering about 19 million souls, had a public debt of about $300 million. Both king and government were poor. The nobles, who had long lived beyond their means, were no better off. The middle class suffered from the ruin of commerce, and the overtaxed peasants, lacking the means to cultivate the land, allowed great stretches to run to waste. End of section 89. Section 90 of The Story of Old France. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark DeSanzo. The Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber. Section 90. The Age of Louis XIV. Because so many great men lived in France during this long reign, the age of Louis XIV is as famous in France as is the age of Pericles in Greek history, or the age of Augustus in Roman annals, or the age of Elizabeth in England. You have already heard of the great generals Turenne, Condé, Luxembourg, Catinat, and Villars, of the great admirals Duquesne, Tourville, and Jean Bart, of the ministers Colbert and Louvois, of the engineer Vauban, and of some famous architects, painters, sculptors, and landscape gardeners. You will now doubtless be interested in hearing something about the orators and writers of so brilliant an epoch. Corneille, for instance, was a tragic poet who wrote plays so fine that they are now French classics, and are still given by the most prominent actors. Racine, his friend and rival, worked in the same field, and it was he, as we have seen, who supplied Madame de Maintenon with suitable plays for her girls. Molière, on the other hand, was the first great French comedian. In spite of his genius, Molière was scorned by the courtiers because his father was only a small tradesman, and even the palace servants, imitating their betters, were rude to him. But the king, who enjoyed Molière's plays, put an end to this state of affairs by inviting the poet to breakfast one morning. While they were seated alone together, the king gave orders to admit the courtiers, and, seeing their surprise, quietly said, "Gentlemen, please excuse me, but I am giving Molière his breakfast, because I hear that my lackeys consider it beneath them to associate with him." Needless to state, the king's footmen never again had a chance to offer Molière a dinner, for the nobles all vied with one another in inviting him to their tables. The author of many immortal comedies which ridicule the follies of his day and the vices and weaknesses of his time, Molière was also a talented actor, and was on the stage when overtaken by his last illness. The gentle, absent-minded fable writer, La Fontaine, delighted everybody in those days with his witty tales of animals and people, which have since supplied the French with a great number of good proverbs and apt quotations. Another member of the literary circles of the time was Boileau, who wrote satires, a poem on the art of versification, and some flattering odes about Louis XIV. When he brought the latter to the king for his approval, even Louis XIV must have deemed them a trifle fulsome, for he once said, "I should praise you more had you praised me less." Still, although a born courtier, the witty Boileau could tell the truth with tact when he chose to do so. For instance, when the king once wrote some verses and asked his opinion of them, Boileau promptly said, "There is nothing impossible to your majesty. You wished to make some bad verses, and you succeeded admirably." The most famous letter writer of the times was Madame de Sévigné, who conveyed all the news of the court to her married daughter in able and sprightly letters that are admired by all who read them. La Bruyère, another famous writer of this reign, is now mostly known for his wise maxims, which are as familiar in France as Poor Richard's are in the United States. Among the great orators and preachers who had the opportunity not only to lecture to the king and court, but also to instruct the royal children, were Bossuet, who wrote a history of the world, Fénelon, author of a French version of the classic tale of Telemachus, and Fleury, compiler of a church history. During Lent, or when some great person died, magnificent sermons or funeral orations were delivered by famous preachers, some of whom, it is said, did not hesitate to tell even the king that he should do his duty. We know that occasionally this preaching had a salutary effect, for Louis XIV. Once remarked to one of them, "Father, I have heard many great orators, and I have been well pleased with them, but every time I have heard you, I have been displeased with myself." The king, whom every one still envied and flattered, was really a sad and discontented old man, and his reign, which had begun so gloriously, was slowly drawing to a dreary end. Madame de Maintenon, in one of her letters, clearly intimates that the positions of king and courtier had their drawbacks, by writing, "Save those who fill the highest stations, I know of none more unfortunate than those who envy them." The king's sadness in old age was due to his many cares and also to family losses, for his son the Dauphin died in 1711, and 1 year later the second Dauphin, Louis's grandson, was carried off with his wife and eldest boy by smallpox, a disease then causing great ravages everywhere. Louis's heir and successor was, therefore, his second great-grandson, who was only 5 years old when his great-grandfather's long reign finally came to an end. After begging his courtiers' pardon for the bad example he had given them, and imploring them to be loyal to his successor, Louis XIV. Spoke a few memorable words to his child heir, saying, "Try to keep the peace with your neighbors. I have been too fond of war. Do not imitate me in that, nor in my too great expenditure." Somewhat later he fell into deep slumber, and Madame de Maintenon, thinking he would never be conscious again, left the palace and took refuge in Saint Cyr, where she was to end her days. But presently Louis opened his eyes again for the last time, and seeing a page in tears, gently inquired, "Why do you weep? Did you then imagine I was a mortal?" A few minutes later, the great monarch's reign was over. With Louis XIV., it may be said, ended also the days of the glorious old France whose story you have read. Little did he dream of the great changes which were to take place in the next 100 years, although they were in part due to causes he himself had set in motion, and which were to make the story of modern France of thrilling interest. End of section 90. End of the Story of Old France by H. A. Guerber.